I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hey! Look who's back for more adventures. We love having you here to continue this story that keeps us all awake. Important note, all of this is pure fiction. So don't try any techniques you hear here in real life, your neighbor might call the cops. This amazing novel and all its rights belong to the original author. We're just the ones giving it voice and drama. Are you enjoying the show? Prove it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and leaving that like that motivates us so much. And if you want VIP access to exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting with things you won't find anywhere else. Chapter 76 National Fortress. Charles had assumed the plane was flying through clouds, though he noticed something strange about the clouds. Soon, the pilot descended, penetrating the thick fog. Suddenly, the flashes of exploding shells seemed to be right below, the sound even making the wings shake. Charles then realized that the clouds were actually smoke from exploding shells. Look, the pilot exclaimed excitedly, we're here. Antwerp is just ahead. Charles wanted to see Antwerp from the air, but he was disappointed. Below, he could see nothing but scattered flashes of light. The billowing smoke even obscured the last remaining glimmer of light. It was clearly morning, but felt more like night. The plane continued to descend, making Charles worried that the shells whistling past below would hide him. He could even see the trails of bullets nearby. A few minutes later, the shelling faded into the distance, and the sky brightened. Only a few scattered shells exploded ahead. Looking back, the area behind was clearly shrouded in smoke, and several large spherical balloons could be faintly seen. It seems we just passed through a war zone, and now we're only entering the heart of the Antwerp fortress, Charles thought. The plane circled Antwerp airport twice before descending and landing smoothly on the runway, only stopping when soldiers below waved signal flags clearing the way. How was that? The pilot boasted to Charles after jumping out of the plane. I told you, we'd get to our destination safely. He pulled a flask from his pocket, tilted his head back, and gulped down several mouthfuls, as if rewarding himself. Hey, a Belgian officer approached, wearing a flat-topped felt hat, a dark blue overcoat with double brass buttons, and a pistol at his waist. The star on his collar indicated he was a major. From a dozen meters away, the major called out to Charles rudely, Frenchman, are you here to reinforce us? Laughter erupted around them, making Charles realize the remark was sarcastic, so he didn't respond. Charles gave instructions to the pilot, stepped forward, saluted, and pulled out his officer's ID from his pocket, handing it over. Major. I'm here to investigate, he said. The major glanced at the ID and handed it back to Charles, spitting disdainfully to the side, his tone full of sarcasm. Very well, you finally remembered us. Laughter erupted again. This left Charles somewhat bewildered. As far as he knew, Belgium had always maintained good relations with France. Now it seemed that wasn't the case. The Antwerp fortress was not a traditional European fortress or stronghold. It was a ring-shaped fortress complex consisting of 29 extremely sturdy fortresses along two lines of defense. The first line had 21 fortresses, and the second line had 8, spaced 2 to 4 kilometers apart, protecting the city of Antwerp at its center with the help of rivers and mountains. While not as famous as the Liège fortress, the Antwerp fortress held the highest strategic position. The Liège fortress served to block the German invasion, while the Antwerp fortress was Belgium's last fortress for self-defense, hence its nickname, the National Fortress. The fortress command was in complete chaos. Urgent calls and calls for reinforcements poured in, each more urgent than the last, but General Guise, the fortress commander, was helpless. Finally, General Guise simply ordered the communications officer not to deliver any intelligence to him, leaving it to the staff to handle. It's no use anyway, General Guise said weakly, preferring to sit in his chair and stare blankly for a while. Before the battle, General Guise made a fatal mistake. He ordered the fortress garrison to clear away all the weeds and trees around the fortress, even burning them down. In General Guise's mind, the war scenario was German soldiers charging at the fortress in dense formations with bayoneted rifles. To allow the fortress's machine guns and artillery to better eliminate these enemies, it was necessary to clear away the trees and weeds that could provide cover. However, the reality was quite different. The Germans leisurely released balloons into the air, and observers on board directed heavy artillery to bombard the fortresses from over 10 kilometers away without haste. Since the trees and weeds had been cleared, the fortresses were clearly visible from the balloons. More importantly, The German heavy artillery had a range of up to 14 kilometers, far exceeding the 10-kilometer range of the fortress's 200mm guns. Therefore, General Guise and all the fortress garrison troops could only watch helplessly as the Germans destroyed the fortresses one by one, day after day, without any countermeasures. General Guise felt some self-reproach. It was indeed his fault. However, perhaps someone else in command would have made the same mistake. Who could have foreseen such a situation? General Guise could only console himself with this thought. Just as he closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands in distress, a communications soldier cautiously approached and reported, "General, we've received a staff officer from France. He's here to investigate the fortress. Would you like to see him?" General Guise looked up as if pricked by a needle, his eyes regaining hope. "From France? Bring him here, quickly." Normally, a French staff officer would hardly see General Guise. But this was wartime, and General Guise had pinned his hopes for Antwerp on reinforcements from France and Britain. He desperately wanted to know France's attitude. However, when General Guise saw the French staff officer, he was greatly disappointed. He was just a second lieutenant, and looked like a child. Don't you have anyone else?" General Guise looked at the staff officer with disbelief. Less than a month into the war, the French were already wiped out? They actually had to send a child to the fortress to investigate and negotiate? Charles didn't quite understand General Guise's meaning, so he could only interpret it literally and reply, "Of course, General. But they're busy chasing the Germans, they're winning." General Guise's expression softened slightly. This was good news. France was winning, which meant they might be able to reach this point and help Belgium drive the Germans out. Thinking this, General Guise politely rose and shook hands with Charles. "Welcome, Lieutenant." After sitting down, General Guise got straight to the point. "So, once you've confirmed the fortress's details, will you send reinforcements?" Charles replied hesitantly, "I can't answer that question, General. It's outside my duties." General Guise glanced at the rank insignia on Charles's cuff and nodded. "Oh, of course." A hint of helplessness flickered in his eyes, as if he had already given up hope. Chapter 77 British Reinforcements. General Guise then let loose, making no attempt to hide his dissatisfaction. He complained, "We've been doing our best to fight the enemy, Lieutenant, even taking on responsibilities far beyond our capabilities, from the king providing intelligence to your country, to refusing the Germans innocent passage and going to war with them, to launching attacks on their supply lines. Isn't that enough? Who else could do that? We didn't have to do this, but we upheld Belgian dignity, which is important, but we've been fighting alone, and when we needed help the most, we saw no reinforcements at all." General Guise spoke with emotion, his words somewhat incoherent, but Charles still understood his meaning. King Albert I of Belgium, during a visit to Germany 6 months prior, had inadvertently heard about the Schlieffen Plan and relayed it to France upon his return. A great deed, a favor done to France, though France hadn't capitalized on it. Later, Belgium risked war with Germany rather than allow it to use Belgium as a route to attack France, which was also a favor to France. Later, when the Germans reached the vicinity of Paris, the Belgian troops, who could have stayed in the fortress, proactively attacked the German supply lines, which again did France a favor. Belgium had always helped France, showing it immense kindness, yet now, when Belgium needed help most, France hadn't sent a single reinforcement. No, there was one, Charles. Charles suddenly understood why the Belgian officers and soldiers had treated him that way at the airport. They shared the same thought as General Guise. "We've given France so much, and France hasn't given us anything in return." Charles didn't know how to answer. The matter of reinforcements wasn't something he, as a lieutenant, had the authority to decide. All he could do was relay General Guise's message back to France, which was perhaps the true intention behind General Guise's complaint. At this moment, a communications soldier stepped forward to report, "General, the British reinforcements have arrived, and Commander General Winter is waiting for you outside." General Guise jumped up. "Excellent. Quickly, invite him in." He immediately left Charles aside and rushed to the door to greet General Winter. General Winter, tall and imposing, entered and immediately shook hands with General Guise. "Salute to you, General Guise. You and your men are among the bravest in the world. Your actions are truly admirable. I am honored to join you and contribute my modest efforts to this glorious war against aggression." General Winter's words deeply moved General Guise, his earlier dejection vanishing instantly, his confidence restored. "Thank you very much, Your Excellency." General Guise gripped General Winter's hand tightly. "Salute to you both, you are reliable and trustworthy friends, extending a helping hand when we needed it most." These words seemed to be a veiled reference to Charles, or rather, to France, which Charles represented. Although Charles could not represent France, in this context, he seemed compelled to do so. Charles was somewhat worried. General Winter spoke with an air of impending victory, though he didn't say it aloud. His face clearly conveyed the message: the remaining defenses are in their hands, rest assured, we will drive the enemy away. However, Charles knew the truth was far from that. General Winter noticed Charles as he entered. The French uniform was always eye-catching, especially the red trousers. "French reinforcements have arrived too?" General Winter asked suspiciously. Before Charles could answer, General Guise interjected, "No, he's here to investigate, a second lieutenant." His words were full of disdain. Indeed, compared to the British, who had sent reinforcements and a general, this French second lieutenant was truly pathetic. It was like someone giving a huge red envelope as a congratulatory gift, while Charles secretly slipped in a newspaper. No wonder he was met with disdain. He was lucky he wasn't kicked out. On Boulevard des September 4th in Paris, Armand and Grevy returned to the estate in a carriage. Amid the rhythmic clatter of hooves, Armand asked seemingly casually, "How can you be sure he won't come back, Grevy? The mission is real, and so is the pilot. The pilot is waiting for him to complete the mission and fly back, and if he can complete the mission successfully?" "That doesn't seem difficult," Grevy replied expressionlessly. "The point isn't the pilot, Armand." Armand looked at Grevy with a puzzled expression, as if to say, "The pilot and the plane can ensure his safe return, so why isn't that the point?" Grevy smiled slightly. "You should know that Charles is already famous, right?" "Of course." Armand nodded. "Almost every newspaper is reporting on him. I'm starting to envy him." Grevy shook his head slightly. Armand would never envy Charles for that. He would only envy Charles if one day Charles had a beautiful and charming female companion. But that seemed impossible. A man who wouldn't return certainly wouldn't have a female companion. Greedy Eye leaned back, crossed his legs, and let out a soft sigh. "So, the Germans know all this too," he said. His voice was soft, but Armand was taken aback, secretly praising Greedy Eye's shrewdness. Charles was an inventor. He invented the tank and the sidecar. He was also a strategist and tactician. He had devised several strategies to defeat the Germans, at least that's what the newspapers said. From any perspective, the Germans wouldn't want to see Charles return alive. They would try to capture Charles and use him for their own purposes, and if that failed, they would destroy him. Releasing a tiger back into the mountains would only put Germany at a disadvantage. And in either case, Charles wouldn't return and certainly wouldn't become Greedy Eye's enemy. So, all that was needed was for the Germans to know that Charles was in Antwerp, and the rest was up to them. Armand asked again, "Aren't you worried he'll surrender to the Germans?" If a talent like Charles surrendered and was used by a powerful Germany, it would undoubtedly be a nightmare for France. Grevy tightened his coat, cast his gaze out the window at the buildings receding into the distance, and replied casually, "That's none of our business, Armand. That's something only France and the left need to worry about." Armand suddenly understood. If this were the case, that is, if Charles surrendered and became a German capitalist, he would drive and develop German industry, and his products would compete with French left-wing capitalists, not right-wing nobles. This would even benefit the right wing, because left-wing capitalists would go bankrupt one by one, and the workers they controlled would once again become peasants. Armand was secretly alarmed. Was Grevy's true purpose in implementing this plan to force Charles to surrender to Germany? He had actually thought so far ahead, and he was only just realizing it. Chapter 78 Huisil? In Antwerp at dusk, the originally gloomy sky brightened slightly as a ray of sunset pierced through the clouds. 25 kilometers east of the fortress, nestled in a basin of hills, General von Bessler, commander of the 3rd Reserve Corps of the 1st Army, stood on high ground, silently gazing ahead through his binoculars. Boom! A deafening roar erupted. A storm of smoke billowed out, and the entire ground trembled as if an earthquake had struck. The shell nearly ripped the air from the ground, creating a gust of wind, and everyone instinctively bent over and covered their ears. It was the roar of the 420mm heavy gun Big Bertha, with a range of 14 kilometers, a shell weighing 1,000 kilograms, requiring 200 men to operate, and only able to fire 2 shells per hour. General Bessler didn't move. He stood motionless like a statue, binoculars in hand, amidst the turbulent air. A minute later, A radial cloud of smoke suddenly rose from the distant, dark gray air, punctuated by a bright flash. The shell had exploded. General Bessler frowned, then angrily called out to his staff officer, "Tell freaks he's wasted another shell, this time missing by at least a kilometer." "Yes, sir," the staff officer replied, running to relay the order. "Those bastards." General Bessler turned back, took a few steps to the ammunition box, and grumbled at the map pressed against it with a bayonet. "Shouldn't they be ashamed of such waste as artillerymen? We should have been standing on the walls of Antwerp accepting Guise's surrender long ago." General Bessler and Guise were old acquaintances. Before the war, Germany and Belgium maintained good relations, with Belgium purchasing most of its weapons from Germany, including rifles for the Belgian army and artillery in its fortresses. Ironically, Belgium was using German weapons to fight Germany. Bessler and Guise were the kind of people who would get together for drinks and chess after discussing business, not close friends, but certainly acquaintances. But now they were forced to fight each other, and Bessler didn't know whether he should hope to see him sooner or never see him again. "General," a staff officer stepped forward to report, "we heard that Charles is in Antwerp." Bessler grunted in response, his eyes still fixed on the target on the map, Waverberg. He was thinking that if he could destroy the fortress, he could cut off the water supply to Antwerp, leaving Antwerp without fresh water. "General," the staff officer reminded him again. "Charles might be in Antwerp." Interrupted, Bessler angrily looked up. "Does it matter who's in Antwerp? Are you going to read out everyone's name in Antwerp to me?" Before he could finish, Bessler suddenly realized something. "Who are you saying is there?" "Charles." "Yes, General. Charles of France? The guy who invented the tank and the sidecar?" Bessler asked again. By this time, the terms tank and sidecar had spread throughout the German army, and Bessler had also heard of Charles. "Yes, General," the staff officer nodded. Bessler narrowed his eyes. "Are you sure? Where did you get this intelligence?" The staff officer became cautious. Having followed Bessler for many years, he knew that narrowing his eyes was a habit of Bessler's, something he only did when faced with critical matters where mistakes were unacceptable. I'm not sure, General," the staff officer said nervously. "We got the information from a Belgian businessman. He just returned to Belgium from France, and he heard something about Charles flying to Antwerp this morning." Bessler paused, then immediately issued a series of orders. "Send men to verify if any planes entered Antwerp this morning. If so, I need to know what type they are." The type was crucial. It would determine whether it was a single-seater or a two-seater. A single-seater would prove the information false, because that little Charles was unlikely to be a pilot. "Move a division." "No, move 2 divisions immediately. We might have to completely surround Antwerp." He couldn't wait for verification before deploying troops. What if it was true? "Send another 10 planes. We're going to surround Antwerp from the air." The staff officer jotted down notes while asking doubtfully, "But General, even if we send planes, it won't stop the enemy planes." "Ram them down, ram them down," Bessler roared. "Go now, do as I say." "Yes, General." The staff officer ran off to give the order. "These guys," Bessler cursed. "They'll never understand how important this is." He then turned his gaze to Antwerp, muttering to himself, "That guy, is he really there? Who sent him here? These idiots." After considering for a moment, Bessler still felt uneasy and turned to call out, "Luca." A guard came running, a rifle slung over his shoulder. "You're in charge of delivering a letter." Bessler nodded towards Antwerp. "Get it to the Belgians and have them give it to General Guise." "Yes, General." In the Antwerp operations office, the bright red lights made the room as bright as day. General Guise and General Winter were discussing troop deployment in front of a map. General Winter said thoughtfully, "I think deploying troops to the front lines at night is a good option. We can dig a trench before the enemy discovers us, otherwise, we might be shelled while digging." General Guise agreed. "The place we need to strengthen the defenses of most is the Waffler Fortress. Once it's breached, the Germans will enter the Van der Mund region through the gap, where our freshwater supply system is located. The entire city will then lose its freshwater supply." General Winter's expression turned serious. He knew what it meant for a coastal city to lose its freshwater supply. "Don't worry, General," General Winter said, "we will organize a defense there. Even if the Waffler Fortress falls, the Germans will face ironclad defenses." General Winter had great confidence in his troops. The British troops were equipped with Enfield rifles, the fastest firing rifles, even more effective than the French machine guns. With them holding the trenches, the Germans would have no chance of breaking through their lines. Just as the two were further discussing the trench layout, a staff officer knocked and entered, handing General Guise a letter. "General, this is from the Germans. They say it's a letter from General Bessler to you." General Guise glanced at the envelope and recognized Bessler's handwriting. "It's definitely a surrender offer." General Guise smiled, casually tearing off the wax seal and pulling out a letter. After reading it for a while, he asked suspiciously, "Who is Charles?" "They say that if you hand over Charles to them, they guarantee they will never attack Antwerp again, and in the future, Charles." General Winter looked bewildered. "Is he here?" Chapter 79 The Important Second Lieutenant. "You don't know Charles?" General Winter looked at General Guise, a hint of surprise in his eyes. Then General Winter quickly realized that since the Germans broke through Belgium, he and everyone else here had been surrounded by German forces, their telephone lines cut off, and they could only communicate by telegram. It seemed normal that he hadn't heard of Charles. "Then you must have heard of tanks?" General Winter asked again. "Even German prisoners of war would know a thing or two about them." General Guise nodded. "I have heard of them." "Is it true?" General Guise assumed it was just a rumor, or a story spread by German prisoners of war for some purpose. "Of course it's true," General Winter replied. "Charles is the one who invented the tank." General Guise said, "Oh," but he remained somewhat skeptical. General Winter laughed. "Without this, Paris might already be occupied by the Germans, but now France is chasing them. It's said the German defeat was a trap set by Charles. If that's true, Charles is truly incredible." General Guise was somewhat convinced. After all, General Winter had better information outside the encirclement, and his statement was both certain and logically sound. However, General Winter then turned his gaze to the letter in his hand, his eyes filled with doubt. "But, what does this have to do with us? Why would they make me hand over Charles?" Just then, the staff officer brought in another letter, again from Bessler. If it weren't for confirming Bessler's handwriting, General Guise would have even suspected it was a prank. Who would send two letters in such a short time? This is a battlefield. Sending letters to enemy commanders isn't so convenient, and someone could lose their life. Why didn't he write everything down and send it all at once? General Guise thought as he opened the letter. Bessler must have been in a hurry when writing these letters, otherwise he wouldn't have done something so foolish. This time, General Guise read the letter aloud. "Please cherish the people's strength, Victor," General Guise's nickname. "Don't put the entire Belgian population under the flames of war any longer. It's pointless and utterly foolish. I'm not asking you to surrender. We will recognize Belgium's neutrality. We only want you to hand over Charles to us, that's all." Before the letter was even finished, General Guise was utterly shocked. Ever since Belgium refused the German army's innocent passage, Germany had refused to recognize Belgium's neutrality, which was also the pretext for Germany's attack on Belgium. They argue that Belgium sided with the enemy and therefore couldn't be considered a neutral. Yet now, they were actually recognizing Belgium's neutrality because of Charles. Is Charles really that important? That a German general would so humbly abandon his principles? General Guise wondered if this was a trap set by the Germans, or another pretext. General Winter nodded firmly. "He's perhaps far more important than you think, General. I don't know how to describe it, because what I know is just hearsay. The ones who truly understand Charles's importance are France and Germany," he added. "The German army was once defeated by Charles, and now it seems." General Guise understood. The Germans' higher regard for Charles spoke volumes. Just then, a communications soldier rushed in to report, "General, the Germans have launched an attack towards the Schelde." General Guise's face darkened. He located the Schelde on the map, west of the fortress. "If the Germans capture this area, our only retreat will be cut off." He paused, then straightened up and frowned. "They've never done this before. They've always hoped to force us to abandon Antwerp." This was the surround on three sides, leave one open tactic. Surrounding three sides and leaving one open would create panic and make everyone want to escape. A complete encirclement would force the enemy to fight to the death. But now, why were the Germans committing this taboo, just when they were about to achieve victory? Moreover, the German army's choice to attack at night, despite their superior artillery, was clearly unwise. General Winter knew the reason. For Charles's sake, they don't want Charles to escape. General Guise was speechless. Was this true? To abandon their strategic and tactical advantages for one person? Had Bessler gone mad? "General," another messenger reported, "the Dutch have informed us that they have to stop accepting refugees because of the German threat." General Guise looked incredulous. From the start of the war until now, the neutral Netherlands to the north had been accepting Belgian refugees, and Germany had never objected. Now, they were threatening the Netherlands to close its borders. This time, General Winter didn't need to explain. General Guise knew the reason. It's for Charles again. General Winter nodded in agreement. If the Netherlands could continue accepting refugees, who could guarantee that Charles wouldn't escape to the Netherlands among them? General Guise couldn't sit still. He stood up and paced anxiously at his desk. Continuing the fighting like this wouldn't just result in casualties among the army and soldiers, but also affect a large number of innocent civilians. They wouldn't be able to evacuate even if they wanted to. But where is that Charles? General Guise lost his patience. Why do they want me to hand him over? I've never even seen him. Just then, the staff officer pushed open the door. Before he could speak, General Guise asked sharply, "Are they here again for Charles?" The staff officer hesitated for a moment, then replied, "No, General. It's a telegram from General Gallieni of France. He says he made a mistake. He sent a very important second lieutenant staff officer to Antwerp. He wants you to send a plane back to Paris immediately. He will be extremely grateful and will do everything in his power to help our army. He also emphasized that you can make any request, and he will do his best to fulfill it, including reinforcements." General Guise gave a bitter smile. "They're all here to ask me for people. Charles is important. A mere second lieutenant staff officer is important. Is there anyone unimportant?" His voice trailed off at the end. General Guise suddenly realized something, and General Winter understood as well. The two exchanged a glance, both seeing shock in each other's eyes. Chapter 80 His Majesty the King. Gallieni didn't realize Charles was missing until nightfall. He had been incredibly busy all day, constantly organizing reinforcements for Antwerp. At this time, the French army was pursuing the Germans across the entire front. Their regular troops were all on the battlefield, leaving only newly trained or still training recruits in the rear. Sending these troops to reinforce Antwerp would be pointless. Therefore, Gallieni needed to review the entire front line to see where he could spare some troops without affecting the current battlefield advantage. This was no small matter. The Germans were no joke, and they could launch a counter-offensive at any moment. After finally managing to squeeze out a division, he then had to plan their route, which was equally challenging. From walking to cars to trains, and finally by sea to bypass the German lines and reach Antwerp, he also needed to contact the Navy for necessary protection. Next, he had to consider logistical support. The Belgian army used German rifles, meaning the French reinforcements had to provide all their ammunition themselves. After a hectic day, things were finally back on track. Gallieni stretched and strolled to the window. His gaze fell across the window onto the Gilbert statue in the garden, standing guard under a lamppost. Gallieni stretched his aching neck and suddenly remembered Charles practicing his military posture in front of the statue. He asked, "Where's Charles?" Everyone around him froze. They hadn't seen Charles in a while. Someone checked the records and replied, "General, Charles has been sent to Antwerp to investigate." Gallieni turned around abruptly, as if pricked by a needle. "What? Who sent him?" "Colonel Durand," the staff officer replied, looking at the records. "It seems you put him in charge of this." Gallieni vaguely remembered that it was true. In his busy schedule, he had casually delegated authority to Durand. But, didn't he know Antwerp was dangerous? Who would send Charles to that place? What was Durand doing? "Send a telegram to Antwerp immediately," Gallieni said. "Tell them to send Charles back." "Yes, General." The staff officer was about to leave when Gallieni stopped him again. "Don't say it's Charles, say it's the second lieutenant staff officer. The Germans must not know Charles is in Antwerp." "Yes, General." Then Gallieni roared angrily, "Where is Durand? Where is he? Get him here immediately." No one responded, because no one knew where he was. A chill ran down Gallieni's spine. He realized this was likely not a command accident, but a conspiracy against Charles. Durand was likely in a traffic accident or some other mishap, and now there was no way to prove anything. Therefore, Charles was sent out by Gallieni, and all procedures were in order. If anything happened to Charles, it would be Gallieni's responsibility. The capitalists could bring down both him and Charles at the same time, killing two birds with one stone. These bastards, playing tricks right under his nose. Gallieni felt deeply humiliated, but more than that, he was worried about Charles's safety. "Hold on, little guy. I'll get you out." At the Antwerp fortress, Charles was alone in the archives, reviewing documents. The investigation wasn't simply about asking about casualties, it also involved understanding the fortress's defenses and troop deployments, so that when reinforcements arrived, they wouldn't be like headless flies, unsure of where to go or what to do. An army must always have a basic understanding of its environment, otherwise, it could mean death. Having almost finished, Charles stood up, stretched to relax, and took out the bread he'd brought from his backpack. He hadn't eaten all day, not because of work, but because he had no appetite for dry, hard bread. At home, Camille forced him to eat. Outside, free, he only nibbled on it when he was starving. Chewing on the bread, Charles walked to the window. It was completely dark. He wondered if airplanes in this era could fly at night. Considering the urgency of reinforcing Antwerp, Charles planned to go to the airport later to inquire, hoping the pilot wasn't completely drunk. Just then, a series of hurried footsteps sounded outside the door, as if many people were arriving. Bang! The door was kicked open. Charles, holding a loaf of bread, stared blankly as General Winter and General Guise appeared in the doorway, surrounded by what appeared to be many heavily armed guards. Charles, General Guise asked, his eyes wide. Are you Charles? Charles Bernard. Charles nodded, looking bewildered. What happened? General Winter and General Guise stood there speechless for a long time. After a while, General Winter smiled and said, the whole world is looking for you, Charles. And you've been hiding right under our noses. Charles finally had the privilege of entering General Guise's operations office. This was originally Charles's restricted area. Things he would spend a long time searching for in the archives could be looked at here with just a glance at a telegram. This left Charles somewhat distraught. Bringing him earlier would have saved a lot of time, now it was pointless. Seeing Charles still munching on dry bread, Guise quickly had milk, cake, and a small plate of fruit brought in. Although Antwerp was short of supplies under German siege, this was still a decent amount of food. While Charles was eating, General Guise pulled General Winter aside and asked in a low voice, have you considered a possibility? General Winter immediately understood what General Guise meant and flatly refused. No, General, you can't do that. Why not? General Guise said, he alone can save all our lives, including the king. General Winter then realized the gravity of the situation. General Guise faced a choice, the lives of Antwerp and the entire city, or Charles. From General Guise's perspective, the former was indeed the better choice, because Charles seemed irrelevant to him, to Antwerp, and to Belgium. German General Bessler had mentioned in a letter, please cherish the people's strength, do not place the entire Belgian population under the flames of war again. This must be an implication that if he doesn't get Charles, he will plunge the entire city into war. But, General, Winter glanced in Charles's direction and said, he's a genius, he can give us far more than we imagine. Before he could finish, Winter understood. Charles's genius was meaningless to Belgium. Belgium lacked an industrial base, they couldn't put Charles's inventions into practice, and it would only make them a target. General Guise's indifferent expression seemed to confirm this. General Winter decided to stop it all. If Charles fell into German hands, it would be a fatal blow to the Allies. However, General Winter suddenly realized that his 10,000-plus reinforcements seemed insignificant against the fortified cities of Antwerp. He was powerless to stop it. At that moment, hurried footsteps sounded outside the door, and a middle-aged man in a magnificent military uniform, sword at his side, strode in. General Guise hurried forward and bowed respectfully. Your Majesty, it was indeed King Albert I of Belgium. He glanced at General Guise and General Winter, noticing the unusual expression on their faces. Or rather, he had already guessed that this was why he had come. Albert I looked at Charles, who was eating and studying a map at the table, then turned his gaze to General Guise, puffing out his chest and leaning closer, seemingly exerting invisible pressure on him. His tone was low and firm. I know what you're thinking, General. I will absolutely not allow you to do this. The dignity of Belgium cannot be tarnished. Chapter 81 The Third Choice. Your Majesty, General Guise pleaded anxiously, this concerns the lives of all of us, there is no room for discussion, General. King Albert I interrupted General Guise without hesitation. I believe the vast majority of Belgians would make the same decision as me. They too will not hand over Charles. Absolutely not, General Guise inwardly grumbled. This was governance, politics, it wasn't a place for chivalry. The king didn't understand the principle that there are only interests between nations. However, General Guise didn't voice his thoughts. He knew he couldn't persuade King Albert I, Just as he had disregarded Belgium's interests and resolutely chosen to go to war with Germany, even attacking German supply lines despite being able to defend himself, thus provoking Germany and bringing trouble upon himself. He should consider what Belgium would gain from all this. Meaningless praise and accolades. The nation and its people might perish amidst these songs of praise. General Guise felt he couldn't stand idly by and watch all this happen. He planned to submit the matter to Parliament and let them decide. King Albert I seemed to sense this. He stared expressionlessly at General Guise, as if to say, I will persuade the Parliament, they will support my decision, because this is the right choice. Just as the group was secretly vying for power, Charles's childish voice rang out from the other side, muffled by the cream still in his mouth. You plan to build the defenses here to stop the German attack. The group initially ignored Charles, believing they were discussing more important matters. However, General Winter's eyes suddenly lit up. Wait, General Guise, General Winter said, perhaps we have a third option. With that, General Winter nodded towards Charles, who was intently studying the map. General Guise paused for a moment, then quickly understood General Winter's meaning. Since Charles could help France defeat the Germans, could he help Belgium defeat them? If the Germans were defeated, there would be no need to hand Charles over, nor would there be any concern about the lives of the Belgian people being threatened. General Guise couldn't help but scoff. You really think he can turn the tide? Winter, you treat him like God, General Winter said. I think trying won't hurt us, right? He then turned his gaze to King Albert I, hoping to gain his support. King Albert I understood and responded with action. He gracefully walked to the table and politely extended his hand to Charles. You must be the Charles they're talking about, Lieutenant, and you are. Charles shook hands in response. I am King Albert of Belgium, King Albert I replied. It's a pleasure to meet you. Charles was taken aback. Meeting a king in his lifetime made him slightly nervous. It's an honor, Your Majesty. King Albert I gestured with his chin to the two generals behind him, indicating that they should join the discussion. General Guise and General Winter understood, one hurrying and the other slowly, walking over to stand on either side of King Albert I, facing Charles. General Guise glanced at the map, reluctantly pointing to a newly drawn line, and answered Charles's question. We intend to deploy British troops here to protect the water supply system. You can't protect anything, Charles interrupted General Guise. General Guise grunted and turned his gaze to General Winter, meaning, this little fellow looks down on your army. Now it's your turn to answer. General Winter was somewhat unwilling. I believe we can, Lieutenant. I brought the best troops. They are well equipped. This has nothing to do with quality or equipment. You will be routed if you can't even see the enemy. Charles pointed to a point behind the defensive line and said, you seem to have overlooked something. Less than a kilometer behind the defensive line is the second line of defense, the Elgin Fortress, which the German heavy artillery will focus its bombardment on. Before he could finish speaking, both General Winter and General Guise understood, and they exclaimed, the heavy artillery bombarding the Elgin Fortress will also destroy this defensive line. 1 kilometer is even within the margin of error of their heavy artillery. God! We are saving ammunition for the Germans. King Albert I looked at the two men with interest. He was somewhat curious how such a thing could happen. Two generals with chests full of medals, yet a lieutenant pointed out a basic mistake. This was not surprising. Belgium had not been at war for 75 years, and General Guise only began to have combat experience a month ago after the Germans launched their offensive. General Winter, a congressman and rear admiral, had only naval experience and virtually no knowledge of land warfare. Charles, on the other hand, possessed modern military knowledge. They were no match for him, not even worthy of being his students. So, General Guise's expression turned serious. Where do you think we should set up our defensive line? We shouldn't set up a defensive line. Charles, having finished eating, wiped his mouth with a napkin. Just let the enemy attack, General Guise asked, puzzled. Yes, Charles nodded. General Guise objected. You may not know, Lieutenant, the German heavy artillery has a much longer range than ours. We're completely helpless. That's why we should let the enemy attack. What do you mean? General Guise didn't understand. Charles calmly picked up two small red flags representing the enemy and placed them on the map. Pushing them along as they approached Antwerp, he said, after the Germans destroy the Waffler Fortress, they'll have to move their heavy artillery forward to have any chance of hitting the Elgin Fortress on the second level. That's right, of course. Several men nodded in agreement, waiting for Charles to continue, but he shrugged, indicating he was finished. And then, General Winter asked, Then their heavy artillery will be useless, Charles replied. How could that be? General Guise shook his head with a smile, a hint of disdain on his lips, as if to say, see. I knew this wouldn't work, Winter reminded Charles. The Elgin fortress's artillery also won't be able to reach the enemy, Lieutenant, Charles countered. What about the Waffler fortress? The Waffler fortress has already been destroyed. General Winter paused mid-sentence, then exclaimed, God, excellent idea. We'll destroy the German heavy artillery, making their offensive insignificant. What? General Guise still didn't understand. Albert I nodded slightly, his eyes filled with amazement and admiration as he looked at Charles. That's a good idea. As long as we camouflage the Waffler fortress and make it look like it's been blown up, the enemy will push their heavy artillery right in front of it. General Guise suddenly understood. He stared at Charles with wide eyes, a mixture of surprise, shame, and, more than anything, doubt. He couldn't believe that such a solution had come from this child. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 82 Breakfast Together. The next day, Charles was awakened by the sound of artillery fire. He knew without a doubt that it was the German Big Bertha heavy artillery. The Germans typically didn't fire at night. Indiscriminate nighttime bombardment had a very low hit rate, and the shells for the Big Bertha were expensive. They would bombard the targets after dawn, guided by balloons, to try and destroy them with the fewest shells possible. Charles was staying in the officers' quarters at the fortress headquarters, in a single room on the third floor with a private bathroom, a VIP treatment in Antwerp during the war, comparable even to General Winter's accommodations. After all, Antwerp was Belgium's last safe haven, and many supporters of the king or those unwilling to be enslaved by Germany had gathered there, leading to a shortage of accommodation and supplies. Even the entrenching tools for building trenches needed British reinforcements. Charles quickly washed up and went downstairs. His plan was clear: go to the airport to return to Paris, deliver the completed investigation report to Gallieni, which was the foundation for French reinforcements to Antwerp. At this moment, Charles was unaware that his mission was already insignificant. France, Britain, Germany, and Belgium, these belligerent nations, were developing a series of targeted operational plans around him. Germany, in particular, had already reinforced its forces with 3 divisions and was still increasing them to prevent Charles from leaving. Yet, Charles's little head was still preoccupied with his investigation report. Downstairs, people came and went. The wartime command headquarters never stopped operating. Charles tried to find General Guise in the crowd to arrange a car, but he didn't seem to be there. Just as Charles was struggling with this, a soldier in a red and black uniform with a sword at his waist approached and saluted him. Charles recognized the uniform. It was King Albert's guard, the King's Guard, whom Charles had glimpsed the previous night when Albert visited. The guard politely said, "Lieutenant, the king invites you to breakfast. The carriage awaits outside." Breakfast? At this time? Charles didn't quite understand. Was this the lifestyle of the nobility? It seemed even Albert I wasn't immune. However, Charles quickly realized his mistake. This was not Albert I's true intention. Unlike Grevie's carriage, Albert I had arranged an open-top carriage for Charles, which Charles assumed was Belgian style and ambience, but this was actually Albert I's deliberate choice. The carriage moved slowly, even though there were no obstacles on the road. 6 guards stood at the front and back, all in striking red uniforms, their red tassels bobbing rhythmically with the horse's hooves, seemingly reminding passers-by to make way. The streets were lined with ragged people, mostly elderly people and women, as well as children of all ages, some crying in arms, others about Charles's age, their faces stained, their eyes filled with weariness and fear. Their disheveled state contrasted sharply with the King's Guard, making Charles, sitting in the carriage, somewhat uncomfortable. The crowd, originally gathered on the street, saw the carriage emerging from the headquarters and unconsciously rose to approach, seemingly wanting to see Charles inside. Charles was puzzled. He hadn't seen so many people gathered in the streets when he arrived yesterday. Was today some kind of special occasion? Suddenly, the carriage stopped. Ahead was an intersection, and a logistics convoy transporting ammunition was passing by. During wartime, everyone had to give way to the army and related units, even the King's Guard. With this sudden stop, Charles finally understood the truth. People slowly gathered from both sides, starting slowly, then rushing forward and surrounding Charles's carriage, shouting at him, "Are you Charles? We heard you defeated the Germans. Can you really lead us to defeat the Germans? They stole our houses and land. Can you take us back? Help us, please." Helpless hands reached out to Charles. Charles was at a loss, unsure how to answer. He could only cast pleading glances at the king's guard, but they pretended not to see anything. Fortunately, the carriage soon resumed its journey under the guidance of guards, leaving the out-of-control crowd behind. However, people continued to line both sides, rising in droves to look at Charles with expectant eyes. Charles understood. Albert I had used him. This wasn't a breakfast together at all, but a morale-boosting parade. Albert I didn't deny it. When he sat down at the table to face Charles, his first words were, "I'm very sorry, Lieutenant. I didn't inform you beforehand, but I believe you understand. Breakfast consisted of a steak and a fried egg. The taste wasn't great, but it was better than bread." "You overestimate my influence, Your Majesty," Charles complained. "This won't do any good." Albert I smiled gently, cutting a piece of beef and elegantly putting it in his mouth. "You underestimated yourself. It's already working." "What?" Charles couldn't believe it had happened so quickly. "It was last night." Albert I tilted his head, chewing his beef as he answered. "Last night, after returning from headquarters, I spread the word that you were here, and then," Charles asked, curious about the outcome. Albert I leaned closer, lowering his voice to answer. "Antwerp was collapsing, Lieutenant. In the 14 days since the German attack, 4,780 soldiers have deserted, and another 30,900 have surrendered to the Germans, an average loss of over 2,000 per day. This was something no one else could hear, as it would affect morale. But since last night, our soldiers have not only not decreased but increased. People have spontaneously requested to join the army to defend Antwerp. What do you think is the reason?" Albert I raised his glass of red wine to Charles, saying, "Now, do you still think I overestimated you?" Charles didn't speak, focusing on his steak. He thought to himself, this king must be spreading false propaganda among his people. He must be exaggerating his own abilities to an unimaginable degree. Boom! The sound of the Grand Bertha cannons roared again. Charles turned his gaze to Albert I, who returned a knowing smile. "Rest assured, everything is proceeding according to your plan. I believe they will succeed." Albert I then added, "Furthermore, I think you may not be able to leave here for the time being, at least not yet. The Germans are choosing a suicidal approach, ramming our planes into each other." After taking a small sip of his drink, he emphasized, "This is unprecedented." Chapter 83 Smoke Pulling. General Guise was commanding his troops at the front. It was less about directing combat and more about staging a deception, a setup, the plan Charles had suggested to fake the destruction of Wafflerberg. The plan sounded simple, but its implementation was still somewhat difficult. Last night, several people, including Albert I, discussed it until 11 o'clock. "How can we fool the Germans?" General Guise asked, frowning. "The Germans have 3 observation balloons. They've assigned observers to watch Wafflerberg with binoculars. They know perfectly well whether Wafflerberg has been destroyed. The observer's task was to observe the impact point of the shells, whether they deviated to the left or right, or hit too close or too far, and then use signal flags to notify the artillery below to correct their trajectory, so that the next shell might be closer to the target." As he spoke, a hint of self-reproach appeared in General Guise's eyes. If the vegetation and trees around the fortress were still there, this might not be a problem. The enemy observers couldn't see the fortress clearly and therefore couldn't detect the camouflage. "That's easy to solve," Charles replied. "We can release smoke around the fortress." "Smoke?" General Guise looked up at Charles in surprise. "Yes," Charles nodded. "Set up a few fires around, and throw some rubber products or old tires into them. They'll make the smoke thick and black, gathering at low altitudes. This will obscure the enemy observer's vision. The downside is that it smells bad." General Guise was both surprised and delighted. For the first time, he genuinely praised, "Excellent idea, Lieutenant." This was great news for General Guise. If smoke could solve the problem, then his mistake of ordering the clearing of vegetation and trees wouldn't be considered a mistake, or at least not a major one. General Guise became more and more excited. The guilt that had been weighing on his back, making it hard for him to breathe, suddenly disappeared. For Charles, it was just a matter of a word, a thought. How did this kid do it? General Winter and Albert were equally surprised. It was indeed feasible, even easy to do, but no one had ever thought of doing it this way. Charles just smiled easily. This was commonplace in modern warfare. When air power is inferior, use smoke. When logistics convoys want to avoid enemy bombing, use smoke. Outgunned and hoping for close quarters combat, they resorted to smoke. The reason people of that era hadn't thought of this was probably because there was no aerial threat. General Guise was the most proactive in this regard. He ordered the entire city to collect rubber products overnight, removing the tires from motorcycles and cars, even military vehicles. Some soldiers protested. "General, what about transporting ammunition and supplies?" General Guise retorted loudly, "How many bullets have you fired?" The soldiers fell silent instantly. The Germans spent most of their time calmly bombarding from beyond the enemy's firing range with heavy artillery, destroying many fortresses without firing a single shot. Besides, the furthest point in Antwerp was only a dozen kilometers away. Frontline transport could be handled by horses or even manpower. At daybreak, General Guise ordered his troops to set fire to rubber around the fortresses. The effect was immediate. The area around the fortresses was instantly shrouded in black smoke. The side effect, as Charles said, was somewhat unpleasant. This was torture for the soldiers hiding in the fortress. The air inside was already extremely murky, and the soldiers had hoped the ventilation shafts would bring in some fresh air, but instead, they were getting in rubber air with a burnt smell. Fortress soldiers immediately called headquarters to protest, including Colonel Eden, stationed at Wafflerberg. Colonel Eden coughed and complained, "General, if this continues, we'll be choked to death by this smoke before the enemy even gets up there." General Guise's reply was concise and to the point, "You make the decision, Colonel. Continue with the smoke, or expose the fortress to enemy fire. Choose one." Colonel Eden hadn't expected General Guise to pass the buck to him. He considered for a moment, but ultimately chose the former. Continue with the smoke, at least there's still hope of survival. Compared to the smoke, the German bombardment was far more terrifying, especially since the shells didn't come all at once, but every half hour. It was like waiting for a death sentence. No one knew if they would survive the next half hour. After hanging up the phone, General Guise grumbled, "These guys, always looking for an excuse to complain." Meanwhile, German Commander Bessler was in a terrible state. At daybreak, he found the target shrouded in black smoke, obscuring everything. He turned his gaze to the balloons above, where observers were frantically waving signal flags, indicating they were in the same situation. "General," a communications officer rushed in to relay the artillery's question. "Major Flex says the artillery is ready. Shall we fire now?" Bessler hesitated. Firing in this situation would be almost a guaranteed hit, a waste of ammunition. "But keep firing," Bessler gritted his teeth and ordered, "Fire at the center of the smoke." "Yes, General." Under normal circumstances, Bessler would never have ordered the firing, but this was a critical moment. Charles was ahead, and he needed to maintain pressure on the Belgians to hand him over. Therefore, even if they couldn't hit the target, they had to fire. Soon, a deafening roar erupted as shells whistled through the smoke. In the instant before the shell landed, the smoke plummeted like a flattened balloon, then suddenly exploded with a deafening roar, sending up a cloud of dust. Bessler realized the situation was worse. The smoke from the exploding shell mingled with the dust billowing into the air, mixing with the smoke from the enemy fires, forming a thick, grayish-black ball that tightly enveloped the fortress, obscuring its center. The staff all turned to look at Bessler, as if asking, "Continue?" Bessler gritted his teeth but still ordered, "Keep firing." Luck struck. On what must have been the fifth shell, this explosion was distinctly different from the previous ones. A deafening roar followed, and thick smoke and flames billowed from the fortress's direction, raging for quite some time. The observer on the balloon signaled, and the staff excitedly translated the flag signals, "The surviving enemy is fleeing. We've seen their wounded." The German soldiers cheered, and Bessler was overjoyed. This was Wafflerberg. Destroying it meant the Germans could cut off Antwerp's freshwater supply, and the Belgian surrender would be only a matter of time. What Bessler didn't know was that he thought the flames and smoke were a secondary explosion at Wafflerberg. But it was actually General Guise ordering the ignition of piled-up gasoline and gunpowder. Chapter 84 Witnessing Victory. After breakfast, Albert I strolled with Charles along the paths of the estate. The estate was simple. Even the villa where they ate was only slightly larger than an ordinary house, making Albert I seem more like a farmer than a king. Of course, This was just his estate in Antwerp. "I'm very sorry, Albert," I said. "I couldn't provide you with a lavish breakfast." "No, that's fine," Charles replied. He was telling the truth. The steak was edible, but what else could a lavish breakfast possibly offer? Pizza? Turkey? Caviar? Albert, I nodded, his tone gradually becoming serious. "Please believe me, that was a special treat reserved for you." Charles didn't understand the meaning at first, but after following Albert I around a wall, what he saw made it clear. Albert I was using his estate to house his people. What came into Charles's view was a vast meadow, presumably the estate's pasture. Various tents were scattered about, with people bustling about and guards distributing food. "They are my people," Albert I said thoughtfully, casting his gaze upon the crowd. "They could have gone into exile, or even to the safer England, but they chose to stay and follow me. Taking care of them is my duty." At that moment, someone called out, "Your Majesty, is that Charles?" Albert I nodded, puffed out his chest, and answered loudly, "Yes, that's Charles, the one who invented the tank and defeated the Germans. France sent him to reinforce us, he's here to help us." These words immediately stirred a great deal of excitement among the crowd. People stood up, and those who had been inside the tents emerged, surrounding him and embracing each other. Albert I turned his gaze to Charles, a smile on his face. "You are their hope, Lieutenant. They trust you." Charles was somewhat confused. This was Belgium, a country he had never been to before, nor had he ever met a Belgian. Why would these complete strangers trust him and see him as their hope? Albert reminded Charles, "Aren't you going to say something to them?" Charles hesitated, looking at the expectant eyes before him, unsure what to say. He worried about letting them down, so he blurted out, "I will do my best, but my abilities are limited." Of course your abilities are limited, Charles," Albert I interjected, "but you are not alone in your efforts. We will all support you. We will unite." With that, Albert I addressed the crowd, his voice loud and powerful. "Answer me, will you fight alongside Charles?" One after another, the people responded, "Yes, we will. Thank you for leading us. We will stand with you. We fight for Belgium." Gradually, more and more people responded, and soon the shouts became a chorus. Charles looked bewildered. He had intended to say, "If I cannot do it, then I regret it," but Albert I had successfully steered the conversation in another direction. Charles looked at Albert I with a puzzled expression, who raised an eyebrow and smiled, nodding slightly at Charles. Albert I knew what Charles had just wanted to say, and he should have let Charles continue. But Albert I understood that one should not speak discouraging words in front of a psychologically vulnerable public. It should inspire confidence or boost morale. Nevertheless, this did not prevent Albert from liking Charles's character. Charles did not boast or show vanity, he truthfully expressed himself and his inner thoughts, which was especially valuable in the eyes of Albert I, who had heard too many grand pronouncements. Those who boast often fail to live up to their words do not match their hearts. Charles could, yet he always remained humble and cautious. This was true and admirable chivalry. At this moment, a guard leaned close to Albert I and whispered something in his ear. Albert I nodded, then turned and asked, "Want to witness your victory together?" What? Charles didn't understand. Albert I didn't say much, he waved to the crowd and led Charles to the other side of the ranch. Before Charles appeared a giant balloon, suspended in midair, swaying gently in the breeze, with a large bamboo basket that could hold 5 or 6 people hanging below. Charles's eyes widened, his steps slowing. Was the king planning to fly away in the balloon? Albert I turned back to look at Charles with a puzzled expression. Charles gritted his teeth. The king's contraband should be safe, right? Besides, he flew across the German blockade. What was a balloon? However, the truth was that the balloon was far more terrifying, especially during ascent, swaying wildly in the wind like a drunkard. Charles was terrified, his breathing rapid and his face pale. Shouldn't this thing have some kind of seat belt? Or at least a parachute? Albert I, however, remained unperturbed, gripping the sling in one hand and observing the distance with a telescope in the other. Fortunately, he didn't notice that Charles was terrified. The balloon rose higher and higher, and as the air current seemed to stabilize at higher altitudes, Charles's heart gradually calmed down. Suddenly, Albert I pointed ahead with delight. "There they are." Charles took out his telescope from his leather case and followed Albert I's gaze, finally understanding what he meant by witnessing your victory. In the distance, 2 massive cannons were slowly approaching, pulled by horses. Even from more than 10 kilometers away, Their towering barrels were clearly visible. These were the German Big Bertha heavy cannons. Albert I took a signal flag from a side pocket and waved it twice towards the eagerly waiting crowd below. A cheer immediately erupted from below. People clapped and celebrated, some even embracing each other excitedly. Chapter 85. All turn around. General Bessler, commander of the 3rd Reserve Corps, rode his warhorse, pacing slowly around the advancing Big Bertha. The sight of the Big Bertha being towed was spectacular. Designed to be quickly disassembled into 5 parts for transport, Bessler, to save deployment time, only disassembled it into 3. The main body of the Big Bertha required hundreds of horses to pull. To this end, Bessler gathered almost all the pack horses, draft horses, and even some war horses from the Army's Logistics Transport Corps and tied them with ropes. Horses pulled from the front, men pushed from behind, the neighing, shouts, and commands filling the air, yet the Big Bertha still moved at a snail's pace of 4 to 5 kilometers per hour. Human walking speed is approximately 3 to 6 kilometers per hour. Fortunately, the Big Bertha was not far from the next level of fortification. After advancing about 4 kilometers, it would be within firing range. Of course, to improve accuracy, Bessler decided to continue advancing a little further. Bessler thought, even if it's closer, it's still outside the enemy's artillery range, but it will achieve a higher hit rate, so why not? However, Bessler quickly noticed something unusual. Several balloons had been launched from the direction of Antwerp. Antwerp had always had balloons. After all, it was a fortified city, and the 29 fortresses surrounding it all needed balloon guidance. But after more than a dozen battles, Antwerp had given up launching balloons. They were useless to them, the enemy artillery was beyond range, and the observers on the balloons could do nothing but watch helplessly. Now, however, Antwerp had launched 3 balloons in succession. Had the Grand Bertha entered the enemy's artillery range? Impossible. The Belgians' artillery was imported from Germany, and Germany had detailed data on these guns. German engineers had even secretly downgraded these guns, rendering them incapable of posing a potential threat to Germany. Then why? With this question in mind, General Bessler grabbed the binoculars hanging around his neck and looked towards the direction of the second fortress. It was too far away to see anything clearly, and the enemy had used the same tactic again: smoke. Wait, smoke. General Bessler suddenly remembered something. He quickly shifted the aperture of his binoculars to the destroyed Waffler fortress, where smoke still lingered, making it appear and disappear. General Bessler lowered the binoculars, pondered for a moment, then quickly raised them again to observe it through the aperture. Something was wrong. General Bessler was secretly alarmed. Why hadn't the smoke from Waffler fortress decreased at all? If Waffler fortress had already been destroyed, there would be no need to release smoke. Even if Waffler fortress had been destroyed in a secondary explosion, its smoke couldn't have lasted this long. Besides, a large part of the fortress was underground. The smoke from a secondary explosion couldn't have spread so widely. Unless. Bessler abruptly closed the binoculars, his face filled with astonishment. He seemed to understand why the enemy had released the balloons. Frex, Bessler shouted anxiously into the crowd, how far are we from the Waffler fortress? Major Frex was Bessler's best artilleryman. He possessed a unique skill. He could determine the exact distance simply by closing one eye and extending his thumb to aim at a target. This was one of the reasons he was responsible for operating the Grand Bertha heavy cannon. Upon hearing the order, Major Frex straightened up in his signature pose, though he was puzzled as to why he needed to know the distance to the Waffler fortress. About 8 kilometers, General, Frex replied. Damn it, General Bessler cursed. Without further hesitation, he spurred his horse hard on the flank, urging it to gallop. He roared from the jolting horse, turn around. Turn around. The grooms and soldiers were stunned. Such a large formation, with their destination just ahead, turn around as soon as they said they would? Major Frex glanced at General Bessler in confusion, then at Wafflerberg, and suddenly a possibility occurred to him. For a moment, his mind seemed to freeze. He stood there, eyes wide and mouth half open, as if time had stood still. After a while, Major Frex finally came to his senses and joined General Bessler in shouting, turn around. Turn around. He waved his small flag as he shouted. Turning the Great Bertha, pulled by hundreds of horses, was no easy task. Trying to turn it around in place by applying force on one side while slack on the other often resulted in it simply not moving at all. Major Frex was experienced in this area. He directed the cavalry to continue pulling the Big Bertha, then used the momentum to slowly turn. At this moment, General Bessler remembered there was still a Big Bertha and hurriedly shouted to his staff officer beside him, "Order Major Jason to turn around." "Turn around," the staff officer responded and spurred his horse to gallop away, man and horse racing towards the other side, waving a small flag as he ran, trying to convey the order accurately to the other side in the shortest possible time. In a balloon in the center of Antwerp, Albert I and Charles had been on it for more than half an hour. They were very patient, as was Charles. It was a delightful sight to watch the enemy gradually close to the range of their artillery, closer and closer. Albert I smiled and asked Charles, "When you came up with this idea, did you consider that with each step the Germans took, they were getting closer to death?" "No, Your Majesty," Charles replied, "I only thought that with each step they took, our artillery's hit rate would be higher." Albert I laughed heartily. This was advantageous for the enemy, so the two chose to wait, chatting idly on the balloon. King Albert I even introduced Charles to Antwerp. "The fortresses you see are all the work of Brilliance, who had a profound understanding of military engineering and a good reputation among engineers. However, it seems he's not quite up to par now. Reports from the front indicate problems with the ventilation systems. They're easily clogged by mud kicked up by artillery shells. If possible, I'd like you to design a fortress for us, Lieutenant. I look forward to your work." Charles simply smiled and remained silent. He knew that fortresses and strongholds were outdated. They were merely targets for heavy artillery. The cheapest and most effective weapon was trenches, layer upon layer. Heavy artillery was ineffective against them, as it wouldn't kill many men, while the soldiers inside could easily hold off attacks from enemies several times, even dozens of times, larger with machine guns. But Charles suddenly wondered, what if he viewed it as a business? Or what if Charles could contract the design and construction of the Maginot Line? Or perhaps, the Maginot Line in history was originally a business? At this moment, the German cavalry's direction changed. Their cavalry, used to tow heavy artillery, suddenly became chaotic, clearly turning around. Albert I smiled slightly. They've finally realized they've been tricked. Without hesitation, he waved signal flags and gave the order downwards. "Sorry, I just discovered the thank you function for donations. I've been wanting to thank the readers who donated but couldn't find where to do so. I'll post the donation list at the end of the month to express my gratitude. You'll know in the future, you can thank them here. I'm a newbie and don't know anything, please forgive me." Thank you to Mole Manor and Biang Heroes for today's donations. Chapter 86 Kingdom Crown Medal. Fire, fire, the order was relayed down the chain of command, and the artillery of the Waffler Fortress instantly roared to life. The Waffler Fortress was a pentagonal fortress, equipped with two 150mm cannons, four 120mm cannons, two 200mm mortars, and four 77mm Krupp rapid-fire cannons. These cannons provided long, medium, and short-range firepower, designed to cover the entire range of enemies attacking the fortress. However, none of these proved effective. The 150mm and 120mm cannons were the ones that truly came into play, firing in two groups at two different targets. The first shots missed, and the few scattered shells either hit close or far. Nevertheless, the shells exploding nearby caused considerable panic among the German troops, proving they had indeed fallen into a trap. They had foolishly dragged their Big Bertha heavy guns into the enemy's artillery range, walking into a trap set by the enemy. The horses, startled by the artillery fire, reared up and neighed loudly. The grooms quickly tried to calm them and regain control. However, everyone knew this situation couldn't last. Caravan horses were different from war horses. War horses were rigorously trained and less easily startled on the battlefield, but caravan horses were not. They could be controlled now, but not next time. Moreover, the sheer size of the herd combined with the heavy artillery made escape virtually impossible. Therefore, everyone's eyes turned to Bessler. The correct choice would have been to cut the ropes, abandon Big Bertha, and flee, thus saving at least several hundred pack horses. But General Bessler was unwilling to give up. He shouted, "Turn around! Maintain formation, bring up the 3rd Artillery Regiment to suppress enemy fire." General Bessler attempted to use the 3rd Artillery Regiment to draw the fire of Wafflerberg, thereby saving Big Bertha. However, he seemed to have forgotten that Wafflerberg was a fortress, its main structure designed to withstand direct hits from 150mm howitzers, and subsequently reinforced twice. Apart from the Great Bertha, almost no artillery posed a threat to it. Therefore, Wafflerberg could ignore the so-called fire suppression from the 3rd Artillery Regiment and focus solely on dealing with the Great Bertha. Boom! The second volley of shells came closer, but still missed. Albert I, observing the battle through binoculars from a balloon, grumbled somewhat awkwardly, "Damn it, they probably can't even get their hands on the meat that's practically in their mouths." "Don't worry, Your Majesty," Charles said calmly, "they're within 2 kilometers of our range. At their speed, it'll take them at least half an hour to escape. We can take our time." Albert I hummed in agreement. He knew the Great Bertha was doomed, but he still couldn't wait to see it destroyed. Finally, one of the 3rd shells exploded amidst the dense herd of horses, instantly turning more than 10 into bloody messes. Many others, injured by shrapnel or the shock wave, lay on the ground, neighing in agony. Even worse, the remaining horses struggled uncontrollably, kicking and thrashing about with all their might, refusing to be swayed by their grooms. Soon, the reins veered off course. The Great Bertha swayed from side to side with the herd, finally losing its balance with a loud thud and crashing to the ground, creating a deep crater in the mud. Albert I excitedly waved his flag to the crowd below, shouting, "We have successfully destroyed one cannon." The crowd erupted in cheers. With one cannon destroyed, Wafflerberg could now concentrate its 6 cannons against the remaining Great Bertha. General Bessler finally realized the losses were inevitable and shouted, "Cut the ropes! Retreat!" But it was too late. Shells rained down, their accuracy increasing with each shot guided by the observers. Soon, a shell hit the Big Bertha directly. After a cloud of smoke, the sturdy cannon remained intact, even the barrel undeformed, only the lower parts were shattered and scattered across the ground. Albert I shouted again, "Victory! We've taken down 2." The people below cheered and celebrated, throwing their hats into the air. For them, this was not just a victory, but also survival. The needs of ordinary civilians were simple, they just wanted to live. The cannon fire continued, shells whistling past, tossing German artillerymen and horses into the air. The German army finally collapsed, abandoning the wreckage of cannons and the carcasses of horses as they fled in panic. Albert had lost interest in watching the battle, he wanted to share the joy of victory with his people. The balloon descended slowly, and before it had even come to a complete stop, the crowd surged forward with cheers. Charles had barely stepped out of the basket when he found himself surrounded by people, faces filled with joy and adoration, and eyes brimming with gratitude. They pushed their way forward, eager to say a word of thanks or shake Charles's hand. "You are a hero, Charles, you defeated the Germans once again, you saved us, thank you." King Albert I seemed to have been prepared. He pulled a box containing medals from his robes and waved it at the crowd. "I hereby declare that, in recognition of a lieutenant's outstanding performance in the defense of Antwerp, I, King Albert of Belgium, hereby award him the Order of the Royal Crown." Note: the Order of the Royal Crown is one of Belgium's 3 national knightly honors and one of the highest honors stipulated in the Belgian Constitution. It is awarded to individuals who have made outstanding contributions to the nation and society, and was established in 1897. The crowd cheered again, with people continuously congratulating Charles. Albert I carefully took out the medal and pinned it to Charles's chest, shaking Charles's hand excitedly, saying, "You will always be our friend, Lieutenant. We will never forget everything you have done for Belgium." "Thank you," Charles replied. Looking back, he seemed to have only said a few words and offered a few suggestions. Suddenly, a loud boom came from afar, and people cried out in alarm. The once noisy meadow fell silent again, and everyone looked in the direction of the sound. They recognized it as the sound of the Grand Bertha. Albert I was bewildered. "This is impossible. We have destroyed the Grand Bertha, all of them." At this moment, a guard rushed over, saluted Albert I, and reported in a panic, "Your Majesty, a 3rd Grand Bertha has appeared. It is bombarding Wafflerberg, and it's beyond Wafflerberg's range." Everyone was stunned. A 3rd Grand Bertha. This meant that victory had not come, and not only had it not come, it had instantly turned into defeat. Because the scam set up by Charles cannot be replicated, the Germans cannot fall for it a second time. Chapter 87: Congreve Rockets. The midday breeze carried the sweet scent of azaleas. Charles walked alone along the path in the fortress headquarters back garden, his expression somewhat dejected. The sudden appearance of the 3rd gate, Grand Bertha, shattered everyone's illusions. Victory, like a beautiful soap bubble, burst with a gentle prick, vanishing without a trace. Furthermore, Charles learned why the Germans had launched such a fierce attack. This was what General Guise had told Charles in the morning meeting. Ignoring Albert I's objections, General Guise stared at Charles and said, "The Germans' target is you. If you surrender, you can save all our lives." Charles knew General Guise's intention. He hoped Charles would surrender to the Germans to save Antwerp. Charles scoffed at this, retorting to General Guise, "Next time, if the Germans demand you hand over the king, what will you do?" General Guise was speechless. After all, the Germans had a history of breaking their promises. If they were to keep their word, they shouldn't have attacked neutral Belgium. The problem still needed to be solved. The Big Bertha cannon fire continued relentlessly. Although Wafflerberg was protected by smoke, if this continued, its destruction was only a matter of time. What other methods were there to deal with it? Charles thought of airplanes. Airplanes were a type of three-dimensional warfare equipment. They could approach and strike targets from the air, thus eliminating the problem of insufficient range. However, at this time, airplanes were unarmed. If they had any weapons, they were bricks, fishing nets, tail hooks, and even flying needles. Should they put explosives on airplanes? European hand grenades were still in their infancy. They were still using spherical explosives. Putting these explosives on airplanes and dropping them would present many problems. At high altitudes, the explosives would detonate in midair without causing any damage to the target. At low altitudes, the explosives would easily shatter and lose their power upon impact with the ground. Even if they happened to hit soft ground and didn't shatter, the enemy would have time to pick them up and discard them or even remove the fuse. And that didn't even consider whether they could hit the target. A normal aerial bomb should at least have a few characteristics: a hard outer shell that is not easily broken by impact. A tail fin ensures stable flight, otherwise, being tossed about by the wind in the air and tumbling aimlessly yields no precision. Finally, a reliable fuse is also necessary. These things cannot be made in a short time, and Antwerp lacks the necessary resources, so Charles had to find another solution. Just as Charles was worrying about this, a group of soldiers hurried past the doorway carrying a bundle of long, pole-like objects. Curious, Charles casually asked, "What are these weapons?" The soldiers recognized Charles and, out of respect, stopped. One of the captains stepped forward and replied, "These are Congreve rockets, Lieutenant." Although his rank was higher than Charles' reputation and the Order of the Royal Crown he wore were enough to command the captain's utmost respect. Rockets, Charles curiously approached to examine them. After a while, he understood what they were. They originated in China and were improved during the Napoleonic era by a British artilleryman named Congreve, hence the name Congreve rockets. By World War II, it had evolved into the famous Katyusha, but in this era, it was almost completely obsolete. "The king has ordered us to make final preparations, Lieutenant," the captain explained. "We need to arm everyone. Rockets are no longer suitable, but it's better than nothing." Charles grunted in agreement, thinking that if it weren't for the need to arm everyone, they probably wouldn't have even bothered to retrieve this thing from the warehouse. "How many rockets do we have?" Charles asked. "I'm not sure, Lieutenant." The captain hesitated before giving a number. "About 200, some of which may be damp and unusable." "Leave them all." Charles didn't hesitate any longer. "Not a single one can be sent out." "Yes, Lieutenant," the captain nodded. However, his face was still full of doubt. What use was such a primitive weapon? Was it meant to destroy Big Bertha? Charles took a few steps, then turned back and added in order, "They're your responsibility. You must protect these rockets and absolutely no accidents are allowed." "Yes, Lieutenant," the captain replied. Charles hurried back to the operations office, where two generals and Albert I were discussing something while looking at a map. Upon Charles's return, they said, "We've been discussing a possibility, Charles. Considering the Germans only have one Big Bertha left, we think we should launch a preemptive strike, or send troops in for a night raid. If the plan is right, we might succeed. Once we destroy that Big Bertha, we'll be safe, at least for a while. This requires your involvement." Before they could finish, Charles interrupted, "It won't be of any use. The Germans are definitely on guard. Any troops sent out will not return. This was their only remaining weapon. The Germans would naturally be extra cautious." Before anyone could object, Charles turned to Albert I. "Your Majesty, I need to go to the airport. Could you provide me with a carriage? Also, there's a squad of soldiers downstairs protecting a batch of rockets. I'd like to send more men to help them deliver the rockets to the airport." Of course, Albert I readily agreed. "The carriage is downstairs." Charles turned to leave, but then remembered something at the door and turned back to ask General Guise, "General, how many planes do we have left?" General Guise looked bewildered. He didn't know the answer either. "I'll make a call and ask," General Guise said. Planes had no impact on the war. Why worry about that? "No need," Charles said. "You don't mind temporarily handing over command of the airport to me, do you?" "Of course," General Guise nodded readily. Currently, the troops had no need for reconnaissance, and even if they did, balloons could handle it. Planes were essentially unnecessary for Antwerp's defenses. Charles said nothing more, hurriedly turned and went downstairs. He had to launch the attack before nightfall, otherwise the Waffle Fortress might fall. The men in the operations office exchanged bewildered glances, unsure of Charles's intentions. He might be trying to break out of Antwerp and return to Paris, General Winter guessed. General Guise paused, then agreed. He must be sending all his planes to confuse the German pilots, covering his own planes as they break out in the chaos. Could that be considered an escape? "No, Albert," I interrupted General Guise expressionlessly, his tone firm. "Charles wouldn't do that. He's not like you, General." General Guise looked somewhat embarrassed and a little angry. He was simply prioritizing national interests, not being a coward. Early World War I aircraft were not well suited for carrying rifles and machine guns in the backseat. It was a three-dimensional space flight at speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour between two planes, their relative positions changing rapidly, making it difficult to even aim a rifle at the enemy. Machine guns, due to the limitations of the aircraft at the time, were often positioned directly above the wing, leaving limited firing windows from the rear cockpit, making it easy to hit one's own wing or tail. Consider this, during wartime, with so many European soldiers fighting for their lives, their sense of urgency was undoubtedly greater than ours. Many of them were intelligent individuals, even scientists. Why didn't they initially carry guns but instead brought bricks, fishing nets, or even steel needles into aerial combat? Precisely because they had tried and found them ineffective. A brick might be more effective than a rifle. Even a rifle shot wouldn't cause significant damage unless it hit the pilot or engine. It would only create a small hole in the wooden wing. A brick, however, was different. With such high speed and momentum, a flying brick could potentially break off an entire wing if it hit. Similarly, a pencil-sized flying needle is more effective than a rifle, and a fishing net might get tangled in the propeller. As for aerial bombs, even those developed during World War II were extremely difficult to hit their targets. They required dive bombers to dive at high speed towards the target, using the inertia to increase the probability of a hit. In the context of World War I, simply throwing any explosive would have been almost impossible to hit a target, and that wouldn't be realistic. To write it that way would be like a farcical drama. Chapter 88. You own an aircraft manufacturing plant? Charles's arrival at the airport immediately caused quite a stir, with soldiers instinctively crowding around him. Perhaps someone had informed him, for the major who had previously greeted and mocked Charles stumbled from his command post to Charles, his voice trembling with nervousness. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I was rude before." Charles had long forgotten about it, but the mention of it brought back a rather unpleasant memory of his arrival. However, Charles didn't have time to dwell on that. He asked directly, "You've received the notification, haven't you, Major?" Charles was referring to the temporary assumption of command. "Yes, of course." The major stepped forward. "We obey your command, sir." He was clever, using sir instead of lieutenant, otherwise, it would seem odd for a lieutenant to command a major. "What's your name?" Charles asked. "Furcher, sir." Furcher's eyes held a hint of fear. When he received the notification, he had wondered if Charles's purpose in taking command of the airport was to retaliate against him. Now, with his name being asked directly, it seemed there was no mistaking him. "How many planes do you have?" Charles asked again. "7 more, sir." The major swallowed hard. Just as he suspected, he must be planning to send me into the air to ram the Germans. "Can I see these planes?" Charles glanced around, seemingly searching for any aircraft. "Yes, sir." The major stepped aside and then led Charles with labored steps toward the hangar. When Charles saw the planes parked in the hangar, he was greatly disappointed. Most were Dove monoplanes, with only 2 Avro biplanes, making a total of 3 including the one Charles was on. "That's all?" Charles asked. "Yes, sir." Charles paced back and forth, then asked, "Where's the pilot who brought me?" "In the soldiers' barracks." Charles's pilot was dead drunk. He lay fully clothed on the bed, snoring loudly. Several empty bottles and half a piece of bread lay scattered around him, the air thick with the smell of alcohol and sourness. "Sir," Major Fisher frowned upon smelling the odor. "I suggest you change pilots." "I can arrange one for you." No need," Charles replied. Having flown from Paris to this point, Charles could sense the drunken pilot's skill level. Others piloted planes, but he enjoyed flying. Charles even felt he had become one with the plane. The plane seemed to be his wings, despite his constant drunkenness. Uncle, Charles nudged the pilot. Finally, the pilot opened his eyes, wiping drool. He stared blankly at Charles for a while before remembering him. "Oh, it's you, little guy. Are we finally going back?" He then sat up. "Sorry, I'll be right there." He rummaged in his pockets, finding nothing, then searched the bottle and the blanket. "Is this what you're looking for?" Charles picked up the flask from the bedside table and shook it. Only a small amount remained, making a slight sound. "Oh, yes." The pilot took the flask, unscrewed the cap without a word, tilted his head back, and gulped it down. Satisfied, he said, "All right, let's go back to Paris." He suddenly seemed more energetic, as if the drink had given him stamina. "Sorry, sir," Charles replied, "we're not going back to Paris for now." The pilot hummed in agreement, then immediately became drowsy again. "Then, when you're going back, tell me, just let me know." Before he could finish, he slowly slumped back onto the bed. Uncle, Charles quickly helped the pilot up, and Major Fisher also came to help. "Can you do me a favor?" The pilot seemed to be more awake, but he and Charles were completely on different wavelengths. He made a couple of sounds, and although he was barely sitting up, he was still in a half-asleep state, muttering incoherently. "I heard you're Charles, kid. The famous one. Which bastard sent you here?" Charles replied, "It's you, uncle." The pilot's reaction was a bit slow, and the next second he suddenly opened his eyes and turned to look at Charles. "Hey, kid, this is no small matter. I'm just hired by the military to be your pilot. No one else wants to take this mission. They know it's dangerous and they don't want to risk their lives for 20 francs. Why did you take it?" Charles asked curiously. The pilot chuckled and sat up straight, replying, "This isn't dangerous for me. I've done much more dangerous things." "You were in the military?" Charles asked. Then he realized something was off. The dangers of flying a plane didn't seem to have much to do with whether or not one had served in the military. A hint of melancholy flashed in the pilot's eyes. He seemed reluctant to answer the question, simply grunting and asking, "So, kid, what do you want me to do?" "Do you know Big Bertha?" Charles asked. "I didn't before, but I do now." The pilot nodded towards the east, where the main German force was located, and Big Bertha was deployed in that direction to bomb the Waffler fortress. The pilot complained, "Its gunfire always wakes me up." Fisher rolled his eyes. This guy hadn't woken up since they arrived. "You just need to blow it up, and it won't bother you anymore," Charles said, casually handing him a towel. The pilot grunted, took the towel, wiped his face, and suddenly stopped, realizing something. "You don't want me to bomb Big Bertha, do you?" Major Fisher was also stunned, giving Charles a shocked look. So it really wasn't about revenge, but about bombing Big Bertha. But how? By ramming it with a plane? The pilot probably thought so too. After all, what else could destroy Big Bertha besides ramming it? The pilot paused for a moment, then gave a bitter laugh, his tone rather desolate. "That would be suicide, little guy. But I accept this mission, but I have one condition." "What condition?" Charles asked. The pilot looked up and met Charles's gaze directly, saying, "Buy my aircraft manufacturing plant." "You own an aircraft manufacturing plant?" Charles stared at the pilot in disbelief. The pilot nodded slowly, his tone filled with sadness and helplessness. "This is nothing to brag about, Lieutenant. I owe the bank 350,000 francs. At first, I only borrowed 10,000 or 20,000, but no one was willing to buy my planes, so I borrowed more and more. Now I can't even pay the interest. Knowing all this, are you still willing to buy it?" Charles understood. This was an entrepreneur persecuted by bank capitalists, on the verge of collapse, even willing to risk his life for some profit. Thanks to Biang du Heoji and Artoria S. Pendragon for the donations. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 89. I'm proud of the money I owe the bank. Eric wasn't actually a pilot, he was an aviation enthusiast who, long before the Wright brothers' invention, had been passionate about flying and made many dangerous attempts that seem unbelievable to later generations. When the Wright brothers successfully invented the first airplane in 1903, Eric thought the world had opened up a new world for him. He even opened his arms wide and cheered towards the sky, his eyes filled with tears, thanking God for finally giving him the opportunity to fly. 2 years later, he sold all his possessions and started an aircraft manufacturing factory. Eric naively believed that many people shared his passion for flying. Who wouldn't want to fly freely in the air like a bird, Eric said. However, early airplanes were extremely unsafe. People did indeed want to fly like birds, but if it came at the cost of their lives, forget it. In 3 years, his factory sold only 6 airplanes, and even then, with virtually no profit. Like many entrepreneurs unwilling to give up their dreams, Eric soon fell into a bank loan trap, and the interest snowballed until he could no longer repay his debts. His wife, unable to bear the dire circumstances, left with their 2 children. All he could do was take on dangerous military missions at the airport to barely make ends meet. When he heard he was to be sent to bomb Big Bertha, Eric's first thought was, what does death matter? If he could pay off his debts and leave some money for his wife and children, he would have no regrets. How much are you planning to sell it for? Charles asked. What? Eric looked at Charles in disbelief. You really want to buy it? You know what it's like. You didn't even look at it, of course, Charles answered decisively. We can sign the contract now, if you bring it. Eric frantically searched his pockets for a moment, finally pulling out a crumpled document. Clearly, he had tried to sell the aircraft factory before, but without success. With trembling hands, Eric unfolded the contract and carefully handed it to Charles. Charles took the contract and glanced at it. 360,000 francs. This figure surprised him. After paying off the bank loan, you only have 10,000 francs left. That's enough, Eric replied. 10,000 francs was a huge sum for him. He would give it all to his wife and children, he owed them too much over the years. As for himself, he hadn't thought about it. Charles handed the contract back to Eric. The expectation on Eric's face instantly turned to disappointment, but he still nodded understandingly. No one would do something so foolish. I understand. No, Uncle Eric, Charles said calmly. Rewrite the contract. I'll give you 400,000 francs. Eric's eyes widened. He simply couldn't believe what he was hearing. Even Fauci, standing beside him, thought he had misheard. 360,000 francs could buy it, but he was giving 400,000? This was the dumbest capitalist ever. That was 40,000 francs, money an ordinary person couldn't earn in a lifetime, money most people would have to work for over 100 years to earn. And Charles, this capitalist, had just given it to the pilot on a whim. Is this true? Eric stood up excitedly. Of course it's true, Charles said, but there's one condition. Eric paused, then smiled slightly, his expression seeming to say, I knew it wouldn't be this good. Unexpectedly, Charles said, you must come back alive, Uncle Eric. I'm waiting for you to manage my aircraft manufacturing plant. Eric instantly collapsed, overwhelmed with emotion, staring blankly at Charles, thinking he was dreaming. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came out. At the same time, he didn't understand. Wasn't what they just discussed buying his life? Wasn't it about flying a plane to crash into Big Bertha? Why could he come back alive and manage the aircraft manufacturing plant for Charles? Seeing Eric's lack of answer, Charles asked again, you don't want to? No, of course I want to, Eric replied. What could be more perfect than getting a large sum of money and being with his own aircraft manufacturing plant? However, Eric asked hesitantly, I can come back alive, of course. Charles raised an eyebrow, turning to Ferschel. Major, can we gather the pilots together? We need to formulate a battle plan. Yes, sir. Just as Ferschel stepped out the door, a communications officer came in to report, Sir, the Congreve rockets you requested have arrived. Charles nodded. Put the rockets in the warehouse and have someone keep them safe. Yes, sir. As the communications officer was about to leave, Charles added another order, select a batch of rockets in good condition. Yes, sir. Upon hearing the term Congreve rockets, Eric seemed to understand Charles's intentions. He nodded slightly, believing that Charles wasn't trying to buy his life with money, although there was still danger. I don't know how to thank you, kid, Eric hesitated. You're very generous, like everyone says, you're a capitalist with a conscience. But I'm not worth this much money, I'm just a drunkard, so you don't need to do this. No, Uncle Eric, Charles interrupted him, his tone firm. You're worth this much money, you just don't know it. Charles gestured with his chin toward the contract in Eric's hand. Major Ferschel's office should have a typewriter, you can go and retype the contract. Signing a contract won't take much time. Eric stared blankly at the contract in his hand. He suddenly realized that if he died, would he no longer have to repay the money he owed the bank capitalists? Selling the aircraft manufacturing plant to pay off the debt, wouldn't that just shift the debt onto Charles? Thinking this, Eric gently tore the contract into pieces and said to the puzzled Charles, "No rush, little guy, you trust me so much, of course I trust you too. If I come back alive, we'll consider the sale. Otherwise, I trust you'll take care of my family." Charles was getting anxious. He did trust Eric, but Charles genuinely wanted an aircraft manufacturing plant. If Eric didn't sign the contract and didn't come back alive, the plant would be taken over by the bank. Uncle Eric, Charles hoped he would change his mind. But Eric's attitude was firm. "It's settled, little guy. Now, tell me, what should I do?" "Okay," Charles was somewhat dejected. But Eric was deeply moved. What a kind child. He desperately wanted to hand the money over to me, just to help me pay off my debts. He certainly didn't want to see me leave this world with worries and regrets. No, little guy, leaving this world owing money to bank capitalists isn't a worry, it's the only thing I can be proud of. Chapter 90 Leopard Rocket. The flight squadron was extremely rudimentary, they didn't even have a combat conference room, and meetings had to be held in Major Ferschel's office. The office was small, crammed together by a dozen or so pilots. Eric was among them, his presence filling the entire office with an unpleasant stench of alcohol and sweat, causing many pilots to frown. Ironically, Charles, almost unnoticed among them, was their commander. Charles sat on what should have been Major Ferschel's throne, casually marking points on a map as he said, "Grand Bertha is located here, 11 kilometers east of the Waffler Fortress. Our objective is to destroy it." This caused a commotion in the office like a bombshell. Soon, pilots objected. "No, Lieutenant. We need General Guilles's orders. Yes, this is war, not a joke. We'll die because of this, and the one commanding us is..." The words were unfinished, but everyone knew what they meant. They didn't trust Charles, and even Major Ferschel chose to remain silent. Eric remained silent, simply observing Charles. He knew Charles's plan was more complex than it seemed. Charles understood. If it were a routine reconnaissance mission, or one where the danger was within their acceptable range, they would acknowledge Charles's command, just as Major Ferschel had said, "We obey your orders." But now, Charles's mission was to bomb Big Bertha, a mission they considered a one-way trip. Such a momentous event, so many lives, entrusted to a child? It was ridiculous. Charles ignored them, continuing to draw his plan on the map. "We'll definitely encounter German interception. They'll try to ram your planes, avoid them, draw their attention, lure them here." Charles drew a circle in another spot with his pencil, like circling a key point in a notebook. "There's an enemy observation balloon here. Blow it up, its flash will attract everyone's attention." And then, Major Ferschel couldn't help but interrupt Charles. "Wait, sir, how can we blow up an enemy observation balloon?" Blowing up an observation balloon at this time was almost impossible, especially from an airplane. Although observation balloons were large targets, few weapons could handle them. Immediately, someone started whispering sarcasm. "He thinks he can just aim his rifle at the balloon and pull the trigger, and pop it like a regular balloon. We might even hear the balloon explode." Bang! The others chuckled quietly. Although they didn't dare to be too presumptuous in front of Charles, their words and laughter were full of disdain. Eric rolled his eyes and crossed his legs. These fools, did they think inventing tanks and sidecar motorcycles to defeat the Germans like the Paris saviors would be so simple? Charles would slap them hard and teach them what true wisdom was. Ferschel glanced at Charles's Order of the Crown on his chest. He felt he couldn't treat someone who had made such a significant contribution to Belgium this way, so he patiently explained, "Sir, balloons aren't so easy to deal with. They have many compartments, like watertight compartments on a ship. Rifle bullets, even machine gun bullets, pose no threat to them." Someone added, "A bullet only makes a hole in the balloon, causing it to leak partially. It can even wait until it completes its mission and then come down to patch the hole, that's all. Yes, it will be repaired within hours and then launched back into the air." Charles didn't even look up. He continued staring at the map and softly asked, Then, what about the Congreve rockets? The room fell silent instantly. Everyone looked at each other, unsure how to answer. Eric laughed heartily, then unceremoniously berated the Belgian soldiers. You idiots. All you think about are bullets and shells. You've completely forgotten about the Congreve rockets. You just received them, and you didn't even think of that. Ferschel looked embarrassed. Eric was talking about him. He had just received a batch of rockets and stored them in the warehouse, wondering what use these primitive weapons could be. They should have been obsolete 50 years ago. However, he hadn't connected them to attack balloons. After a moment's thought, Ferschel nodded. This might work. I mean, the chances of success are very high. We all know balloons are filled with hydrogen. Once they encounter a rocket, it'll instantly turn into a fireball. The more Ferschel spoke, the more incredulous he felt this was a brilliant idea. It was bound to succeed. But then someone raised a question. How can we get the rocket onto the plane and launch it? The rocket might not be able to penetrate the balloon's flexible outer layer. It might even bounce off and fly in another direction. Charles provided answers one by one. Getting it onto the plane is easy. We just need to secure it to the vertical struts between the wings. Penetrating the balloon's outer layer isn't difficult. We just need to attach a blade to the tip of the rocket so it can cut through the balloon's outer layer instead of bouncing off. Eric laughed smugly again, his head held high as he swept his disdainful gaze across the room, unabashedly cursing, a bunch of idiots. Let me show you the wisdom of France. The Belgian pilots, though deeply ashamed by the insult, still had excitement in their eyes. After all, they were fighting for Belgium, and no one would refuse victory. Moreover, this was a feat of bombing a balloon from a plane, a first in human history. This battle might even be recorded in history, and they would undoubtedly become heroes, their names etched in the annals of time. Upon realizing this, the pilots' gazes towards Charles instantly changed, filled with astonishment and admiration. They couldn't believe this young man could come up with such a brilliant idea, using equipment forgotten in warehouses and destined for obsolescence. Charles remained calmly seated at his desk, finding nothing to boast about. This wasn't his invention. 2 years later, a French Air Force lieutenant, Lee Prior, devised the same method, attaching sharp blades to the tips of rockets, securing them to vertical struts between the wings of a biplane, and then, between 1916 and 1918, hundreds of reconnaissance balloons were destroyed. This primitive method of warfare, the Lee Prior rocket, was only rendered obsolete once again after the advent of machine gun incendiary bombs. Lee Prior rockets, with sharp blades at the tips capable of slicing through the outer layer of balloons, a British seaplane carrying 8 rockets. Chapter 91 Integration Pilots. Major Ferschel was the first to notice the problem. He cautiously looked at Charles, his eyes filled with uncertainty. Sir, if the rocket is fixed to the vertical strut of the biplane, does that mean only biplanes can carry it? Yes, Charles nodded. Only biplanes have vertical struts. Monoplanes lack space, and their extensive use of linen fur skin makes them easily burned through or even ignited by the exhaust flame, thus making them unsuitable for carrying rockets. This was why he was disappointed to see the Dove monoplane in the hangar. The pilots and Major Ferschel immediately looked troubled. They only had 2 biplanes, and including Eric Zavro, they only had 3. Ferschel gradually understood why Charles insisted on Eric joining them. However, with 3 planes carrying rockets, destroying both the balloon and the Big Bertha, wasn't that unrealistic? Soon, some voices wavered. Perhaps destroying the balloons is a good option. Without their guidance, the Big Bertha won't be able to hit its targets accurately. Yes, there's not much need to destroy the Big Bertha, we just need to destroy its size. Besides, the Congreve rockets are very inaccurate. They're fine for hitting large balloons, but very difficult for the Big Bertha. These words were clearly self-deception. The balloons weren't the Big Bertha's eyes, they were its aids. Without the balloons, the artillery could still aim using binoculars and distance estimation. Charles listened quietly, without speaking. Eric couldn't hold back any longer. He sneered, a bunch of cowards, wimps. This seemed to sting the Belgian pilots. They glared at Eric angrily, one of them warning, watch your words, Frenchman. Know that the men you call cowards are fighting against the mighty Germany alone. Oh, is that so? Eric retorted without hesitation. That's someone else, sir, but certainly not you. You just want to easily blow up the balloon and then wait for the king to award you medals, don't you? Then Eric adopted a coy, womanly manner, shrilling, wow, we blew up the balloon, stop the German bombing. We're so great, You should reward us." Before he could finish, the pilot was about to rush forward, but was stopped by the others. Eric raised his chin defiantly and continued taunting. "What? Did I hit a nerve? Admit it, clown." Charles remained silent. Eric's appearance wasn't exactly flattering, but he was right. These Belgian pilots did indeed want to gain impressive credit in an easy way and then retire gracefully. From their perspective, there was nothing wrong with that. Destroying the German balloon was already a remarkable achievement. Why risk their lives for something else? If they died while destroying Big Bertha, wouldn't they gain nothing? Therefore, the real warrior was Eric, one of the pilots to launch the attack, flying a rocket-powered biplane that would attract the enemy's special attention. Eric should have stood with these pilots. That way, he wouldn't have had to take such a big risk, and he'd have a better chance of survival and even gain honor. But Eric didn't do that. He chose to fight to the end. Looking at the arguing crowd, Charles calmly said, "If we don't destroy Big Bertha before nightfall, the Waffle Fortress might not hold out until tomorrow." "What? Impossible. Why?" The crowd stopped arguing and unanimously turned their questioning gazes to Charles. Major Futchell questioned Charles's words. "Sir, the Big Bertha has never attacked at night." "That was before," Charles replied, then softly countered, "Before, visibility was much better during the day than at night." "What about now?" Major Futchell suddenly realized. "We used smoke. The Germans can't see anything even during the day." "Yes," Charles concluded, "since they can't see anything during the day, why not attack at night? There's no difference between day and night. Besides, the Germans originally had 3 Big Berthas, but now only 1 remains, which means they have surplus ammunition." Major Futchell nodded thoughtfully. The ammunition for all 3 guns was concentrated on the remaining 1, so ammunition was plentiful. Under these circumstances, the Germans would likely continue bombarding at night. They could fire 24 shells in 12 hours. If even one hit the Waffler Fortress, Antwerp would be finished. Eric chuckled. "I don't want to be woken up by them at night." Then he looked around. "Oh, does anyone have any wine?" No one paid him any attention. Some even stared at him with incredulous looks. "You have time to look for wine at a time like this?" In other words, Major Fuscher's face turned grim. He glanced at his watch and said worriedly, "We only have a little over 3 hours left." Charles added coldly, "And you are still arguing about whether or not to bomb Grand Bertha." His words made everyone lower their heads, especially the Belgian pilots who had been harboring their own thoughts, feeling deeply ashamed. "The fate of Antwerp is in your hands, gentlemen." Charles's tone was light, but his words were heavy. "It's up to you what you do. Hundreds of thousands of lives, the fate of Belgium, including your families and friends." Everyone fell silent, except for Eric, who continued rummaging around, seemingly oblivious to the situation. After a while, someone stepped forward and said, "We'll listen to you, sir. What are your orders?" "We'll do as you say." Charles turned his gaze to Eric, who was still fidgeting. Eric felt Charles's gaze, sat up, and shrugged. "What are you looking at me for? I've always been on your side." Charles smiled. "Uncle Eric, I'd like to know if you can cooperate with them." Eric glanced at the people beside him, a hint of disdain on his lips. "Cooperate with these cowards? Forget it, I'll do it myself." "Excuse me, sir," the Belgian pilot apologized. "You're right, we must bomb Big Bertha, sir. You're fighting for Belgium. We should be grateful. You're very brave. We hope to fight alongside you." "I'm not buying it," Eric interrupted the pilot's heartfelt confessions. "You'll get me killed." The pilots were stunned. He was unmoved by either soft or hard tactics. Someone, quick-witted as ever, secretly pulled a flask full of liquor from their pocket and handed it over. Eric took it, shook it, opened the lid, smelled it, and immediately surrendered with a look of pure bliss. All right, it's just blowing up some stuff. Let's do it together." The pilots smiled knowingly. Charles watched all this with satisfaction. Uniting the pilots into a cohesive force was a crucial step in the plan's successful execution. His plan required close cooperation from all pilots, even to the point of sacrificing themselves to protect others. It wouldn't have been possible without recognizing the gravity of the situation, or without unity and a spirit of self-sacrifice. Chapter 92 Zeppelin Airship. Adding rockets wasn't difficult. It simply involved attaching the selected rockets to the vertical struts between the wings, a process that took about half an hour. The real challenge lay in ignition. How do we ignite them? The question, as always, came from Major Futchell, perhaps reflecting his experience managing the entire airfield. He habitually considered the possibility of the process stalling at some point. Eric glanced at the fuse on the rocket and said, "If we use a fuse for ignition, we can't accurately estimate when it will launch, making it impossible to pinpoint the nose of the aircraft to the target in time." The pilots readily agreed. Air combat differed from infantry combat. In infantry, a little time didn't matter, the rocket would always reach the enemy and be effective. In air combat, however, the aircraft was flying at high speeds, and the time it took to dive and point at the target could be only a few seconds. If the rocket failed to launch due to a fuse delayed during this period, it meant mission failure. But this wasn't a problem for Charles. Use electricity to detonate the detonators. Charles turned to Major Ferschel and asked, "Do we have any?" Note, electric detonators, also known as electric detonators, were invented in 1876. Major Ferschel was taken aback, then nodded with delight. "We don't, but the engineers should have some. I've seen them use wires to detonate bridges. I'll contact them right away." The problem was perfectly solved. Major Ferschel even called a group of engineers for help. The engineers were initially reluctant, as they had their own tasks. But Major Ferschel said, "Do you know who's commanding the flight squadron now? It's Charles. You should have heard of him, right?" The engineers immediately sent men. Due to their unfamiliarity with the situation, they even sent an entire engineering company of over 200 men. In the Fortress Command's operations office, the clock on the wall chimed twice. It was 2 in the afternoon. Different colored flags represented different units on the map, and several attack routes were drawn in pencil. Next to it were several documents containing the newly recorded operational plans. General Guise, brimming with confidence, surveyed the scene and declared, "We will succeed. We know the terrain, while the Germans do not. They won't expect our army to bypass them via the side roads and attack from both sides." General Winter hesitated, asking, "Should we let Charles review the battle plan? After all, last time, he immediately spotted the flaws in our defensive lines." General Winter lacked confidence in himself, or rather, in both himself and General Guise. Albert I wasn't involved in the discussion. He had no experience commanding troops and lacked the necessary knowledge and expertise. General Winter knew this was unwise. He couldn't rely on Charles. But this was war, and a single misstep could cost many lives, especially since this might be their last chance. "No," General Guise refused without hesitation. "We don't need the advice of someone preparing to flee." Winter, Albert I remained silent. He still didn't believe Charles would escape. During this time, Albert I considered going to the airport to see what Charles was doing, but forcibly suppressed the urge. What if Charles really was preparing to flee? Although Charles had made special contributions to Belgium, earning a Royal Crown Medal for his meritorious service, this did not mean he could sacrifice the lives of Belgian pilots for his own. This was a matter of principle. Therefore, if Albert I discovered this, he would have to stop Charles, and Charles would not be able to escape. So he couldn't go. Without going, he wouldn't know, and without knowing, everything Charles did was within procedure, so Albert I didn't need to stop him. Perhaps it would be a good thing if Charles could escape, Albert I thought. After all, he was still a child, the war had already burdened him too much, and he had done enough. He had a clear conscience. Besides, future battles would need him. There was no point in him staying here to be captured by the Germans. Just as General Guise was about to rehearse his raid plan one last time, a communications soldier rushed in and reported, "General, airships, German airships." Several men's expressions changed drastically, and they simultaneously dropped everything and rushed out of the office. To the east of the fortress, under a pale, overcast sky, a German airship was slowly approaching Antwerp. Its hull resembled a giant cloud, floating lightly and moving so slowly it was almost imperceptible to the naked eye, yet clearly drawing closer. Albert I expressionlessly put away his binoculars and asked his advisor, "How much longer until it reaches our airspace?" "I'm not sure, Your Majesty," the advisor replied. "About 2 hours, 2 hours, roughly 4 in the afternoon." General Guise glanced at the airship's trajectory, then focused his beam on the Waffler Fortress in its extended path, and concluded, "Its target is Waffler Fortress. The Germans intend to bomb it simultaneously with airships and heavy artillery." Albert I shook his head. "No, its target is the water supply system behind Waffler Fortress." General Guise immediately accepted this explanation. The water supply system was far more vulnerable than the fortress. It was completely exposed to the ground, and even a lack of direct impact could cripple it. General Guise's expression shifted rapidly. and he immediately ordered the communications officer, organize firepower immediately to prepare for interception. We must not let it get close. Yes, General, the communications officer replied and left. Albert I shook his head with a wry smile. Everyone knew it wouldn't work. The airship was over 1,000 meters above the ground. Antwerp might be able to reach it, but all the artillery was inside the fortress. Rifle bullets might be able to reach it, but the damage they could inflict would only be a few tiny, barely visible holes in its outer shell. General Winter couldn't help but exclaim, "What a terrifying behemoth! They actually built such a thing." "Yes," Albert I sighed, "the Germans call it the invincible cannon, and some even call it the unsinkable warship. They believe it's an invincible weapon, and indeed it is. The only thing that can stop it is perhaps the unpredictable weather. Because of their lightweight and large size, airships were often blown away by the sea breeze and disappeared into the ocean, never to be found again. But now." Albert I looked at the sky. Although the weather wasn't great, there was no sign of wind picking up. "Only God can save us." Albert I's voice was filled with helplessness and sorrow. The image above shows the Zeppelin airship. The traces of its aluminum keel are clearly visible. Chapter 93 is Seal. It must be Seal. Albert I was right. The airships were indeed targeting the water supply system behind the Waffler fortress. This was mainly because General Bessler had become impatient, or rather, driven to his wits' end by Charles. It must be Charles's doing, it must be. After the two Grand Berthas were destroyed, General Bessler returned to headquarters, covered in dust and limping. He had fallen from his horse, a shell had exploded nearby. His well-trained war horse, though still under control, was surrounded by horses breaking free and running wildly. Suddenly, several ropes tripped General Bessler and his horse, pinning his left leg beneath the horse. Frightened horses still galloped around him, mud kicked up by their hooves even splashing onto General Bessler's face. Fortunately, guards rushed up and rescued him, saving him from being trampled to death. Enraged, Bessler ripped off his military cap and slammed it on the table. "General," a staff officer stepped forward to comfort him, "we still have one Big Bertha. Victory is still ours. Is that what you think?" Bessler turned and looked coldly at the staff officer. The staff officer's eyes were full of doubt. Wasn't that the situation? Bessler smiled slightly. "A deception, a trap, lured our two Big Bertha rifles into their range. What do you think of?" The staff officer looked bewildered, hesitated, and shook his head. He hadn't thought of anything. Bessler glanced at the staff officer's rank and said expressionlessly, "Major, you're now a second lieutenant. Go get a rifle and report to the 1st Regiment." The staff officer's face turned pale instantly, but after a moment of stunned silence, he still stood up, saluted, and retreated. "That idiot," Bessler muttered, "still hasn't figured out it's Charles's doing." Then, looking thoughtfully at the map, he added, "We can't wait any longer. Who knows what else Charles might pull." So, an airship originally destined for the front lines to bomb France was urgently summoned by General Bessler. Approaching Antwerp at 80 kilometers per hour, General Bessler repeatedly telegraphed the airship's commander, Captain DM, to verify the target location, guiding him into the precise bombing zone. The airship gradually drew closer to Antwerp, its massive, terrifying hull blocking out the entire sky, casting its shadow over the ground, including Bessler's command post. The nearby Dove aircraft, providing guidance and protection, appeared like insignificant, harmless spats beside the airship. The distinctive buzzing of its powerful engine seemed to proclaim its territory and authority to everyone. General Bessler gazed up at the aerial behemoth, his eyes filled with pride. He murmured to himself, "This is a miracle of humankind. No one can stop its advance, not even Charles." German soldiers scrambled to their feet from their bunkers, some even emerging from their tents. They cheered at the airship, smiles spreading across their faces, as if its arrival signified the end of the battle. Opposite them, the people of Antwerp also spotted the slowly approaching monster. After all, it was over 100 meters long and 20 meters in diameter, conspicuous even at 1,500 meters. People stared at it in horror, unable to believe such a weapon existed. Even the fortress guards who had been stationed in the fortress emerged and looked up at the sky, each with a premonition of impending doom. They thought, even Charles was powerless before this monster. Charles was utterly insignificant, negligible. This wasn't because they looked down on Charles, but because they believed such a weapon was beyond human resistance. Even Albert I, who had always believed in Charles, had lost all hope. He, along with Generals Guise and Winter, stood atop the highest watchtower of the command post, silently awaiting the arrival of doomsday. They had considered every possible method, but nothing could stop its advance. Undoubtedly, Antwerp would face a destroyed water supply system. Soon the entire city would lose its fresh water supply, and then be forced to surrender. However, those whose attention was drawn to the airships failed to notice that several planes were taking off from Antwerp airport, only a few kilometers away. At first, people thought they were German planes, until the planes swept overhead, clearly revealing the Belgian markings under their wings. "Those are our planes," Albert I exclaimed. General Guise also noticed, but he remained resigned. So what? General Guise was telling the truth. In this era, planes were often the targets of airships. Airships were equipped with heavy machine guns in all directions, and their stable flight provided the gunners with a stable firing platform, an aerial firing platform. More importantly, the airships weren't much slower than airplanes. Airships traveled at 80 kilometers per hour, while airplanes only reached around 100 kilometers per hour. At that time, reconnaissance planes dared not even approach the airships, as doing so would only result in one outcome, being mercilessly torn to shreds. Albert I hesitated for a moment, then said, "This at least proves I was right, General." "Your Majesty means?" General Guise looked at Albert I with a puzzled expression. Albert I reminded him, "You've forgotten who's commanding the flight squadron, General." General Guise said, "Oh," then added, "You mean Charles didn't escape?" "Yes." Albert I proudly looked at the planes flying towards the airships. "Look, they are the first brave warriors to charge into the enemy." General Guise laughed. "Unfortunately, Charles wasn't among them, Your Majesty. They were merely used by Charles. Right now, Charles is probably in another direction, flying towards Paris." Before he finished speaking, a plane launched something. It was clearly visible, with a long contrail and a distinctive whistling sound. Everyone saw it. "What's that?" General Winter looked up at the sky in surprise, then raised his binoculars. Before he finished speaking, the contrail pointed directly at the airship. With a loud boom, it exploded in a burst of fire, but unfortunately, the airship didn't explode. The pilots later speculated that perhaps the rocket had hit the airship's aluminum keel and bounced off, failing to tear it apart. The rocket detonated externally, isolated by the outer skin. But this was enough to make everyone pale, including the German soldiers who had been confidently looking up at the sky. General Bessler was horrified. Although he didn't know what weapon it was, he knew what it meant. "It's Charles, it must be Charles." General Bessler's eyes were glazed, his face ashen, and he muttered, "He got there first." This last sentence is a separate, unrelated comment, successfully advanced to the 4th round of recommendations this week. Thank you all for your continued reading and support. I'm a complete newbie, I don't understand many of the rules. And I'm not familiar with the assistant function either. I only discovered these past 2 days that I can speak here and post pictures in the main text. I always thought that beginners should have the awareness of beginners, and that getting 2 or 3 rounds of recommendations and being listed would be good enough. I never expected to go through 4 rounds of recommendations, and I'm so glad and grateful. This is all thanks to everyone's continued reading. Although there weren't many bookmarks due to the niche subject matter, the reading data has been steadily increasing. This at least shows that everyone who has collected this book appreciates it. Allow me to be a little narcissistic. Also, I found that many friends are quite knowledgeable about World War I, which surprised me. I thought not many people knew about World War I, but one expert after another popped up in the book review section, which put a lot of pressure on me. Cyrillic letter vent. Thank you all again, and thank you for reading. Chapter 94 Hot Air Balloon. The appearance of the Zeppelin disrupted Charles's plans. He had originally intended to draw the attention of German aircraft by destroying reconnaissance balloons. Destroying one balloon would cause biplanes to appear and then swoop towards another, leading everyone, including the German aircraft, to assume the biplane's target was the balloons, and the German planes would circle around to protect them. Then, unexpectedly, the biplanes would suddenly dive to attack the ground-based Big Bertha. The arrival of the Zeppelin made Charles realize that it might be a more attractive target for German pilots. When it was ignited, the explosion and flash would be spectacular, causing the Germans to forget they possessed a weapon that could win and needed protection, the Big Bertha. Therefore, Charles immediately turned his attention to the Zeppelin. He divided his aircraft into 2 squadrons, one consisting of 1 biplane and 2 Dove monoplanes, and the other of 2 biplanes and 3 Doves. The former, led by Major Fuchsel, was tasked with destroying the Zeppelin. The latter, led by Eric, was tasked with destroying Big Bertha. Charles's plan demanded that everyone be warriors. Dove monoplane pilots must be prepared to sacrifice themselves to save the biplanes. Biplanes are the spearhead against the enemy. If they are destroyed by the enemy, the mission is doomed to failure. Biplane pilots, you must entrust your lives and safety entirely to the Dove. Your mission is to destroy the target. If you also have to evade the enemy and change your flight path, it will be almost impossible to complete the mission. Even a small maneuver could affect the rocket's launch trajectory. The pilots nodded heavily. They understood Charles's words. It wasn't difficult to grasp. The difficulty lay in, would they really have the courage to do it in actual combat? To sacrifice themselves to save others? Or to entrust their safety to the self-sacrifice of others? The thought was terrifying. Major Furcher led the first squadron to take off first, rushing towards the Zeppelin. At the same time, the second squadron, led by Eric, also took off and stealthily approached Big Bertha. Major Furcher was initially somewhat uneasy. I should have been bombing the Big Bertha instead of that drunkard, Major Futchell muttered. He always carries that jug of liquor. I've never seen him sober, and we're pinning Antwerp's hopes on him. But when Major Futchell saw the massive airship in the sky, his eyes widened. Bombing this thing is way more exciting than bombing the Big Bertha, he exclaimed. The mission went surprisingly smoothly. The Germans didn't react at all when Major Futchell's 3 planes approached the airship. Neither machine guns nor aircraft even blinked, not even deigning to glance at them. Charles, observing through binoculars from the airport observation post, initially found it strange, but soon understood. The Germans didn't consider them dangerous. After all, aircraft at this time were unarmed. The German pilots' orders were to prevent Charles from escaping, and therefore they would ram any planes attempting to leave Antwerp. Major Fuscher's 3 aircraft didn't even leave Antwerp. The Germans assumed they were there to witness the miracle of the German Empire, so let them have their way. They couldn't do anything anyway. After realizing this, Charles regretted his decision. He hadn't expected the German pilots to react this way. If he had known, there would have been no need for a plan. He could have easily concentrated his 3 biplanes to bomb the Big Bertha and then dealt with the airship slowly. At that moment, Major Fuscher fired a rocket at the airship. The rocket hit the airship directly, but surprisingly, it didn't explode. The situation immediately changed. The Germans realized these Belgian planes weren't as harmless as they had imagined, and they immediately tensed up and launched an attack. The machine guns were the first to attack. With a burst of gunfire, one of Major Fuscher's Doves, which was providing cover, had its wings severed instantly. It spun in the air, lost its balance like a wounded bird, and crashed to the ground without a bang or explosion, simply disintegrating into fragments scattered on the ground. Meanwhile, German Dove biplanes immediately approached Major Fuscher. They seemed to have discovered that only biplanes were armed, naturally making Major Fuscher their primary target. Major Fuscher, while piloting his aircraft, complained, "Damn it, this thing is useless. We're wasting our time." His previous failure led him to believe that the rockets couldn't penetrate or detonate the airship. What to do now? With a let's give it a try mentality, he once again piloted his aircraft around, this time launching 5 rockets in one go. Since they were all useless anyway, what was the point of keeping them? That's what Major Fuscher thought. If time allowed, he would have fired all the remaining rockets at once. Boom, a loud explosion rang out, and the airship suddenly burst into flames. This startled the unprepared Major Fuscher, who hurriedly maneuvered his aircraft to evade. 2 German Dove biplanes that had been charging towards him couldn't stop their momentum and crashed directly into the rolling flames, instantly incinerating them. It worked. It worked, Major Fuscher laughed heartily, unable to resist turning back to look at his masterpiece. Explosions rippled through the airship, one after another. Its internal compartments detonated, one explosion triggering another, like falling dominoes, only far more violent. In a short while, the entire airship transformed into a fireball in midair, like a giant lantern, burning fiercely. Incredibly, it remained suspended in the air. At this moment, it might not have been a hydrogen balloon but a magnificent hot air balloon. It seemed to want to linger a little longer, to savor the most dazzling and glorious moment of its life, but ultimately, with reluctance and longing, it slowly plummeted amidst the desperate screams of its passengers. Everyone was stunned. Albert I was utterly shocked. He couldn't believe that just a few small objects with trails of smoke could destroy such a massive monster. He had thought it would at most cause minor damage or force it to land. But the truth was that this monster, seemingly indestructible, was actually incredibly fragile. Or rather, a smile gradually appeared on Albert I's face. To be precise, it was utterly vulnerable before Charles. Albert I's gaze remained fixed on the burning, plummeting airship, and he asked calmly, "General, do you still think Charles is planning an escape?" General Guise was speechless. He stared in disbelief at everything before him, completely stunned by the scene before him. That unassuming child possessed such immense power. Anyone who still thought he was planning an escape at this point was surely insane. Was he perhaps trying to annihilate the Germans? Thank you Tinku for the donation. Many thanks. Chapter 95 I was tricked by Seal again. Inside Antwerp, hundreds of thousands of people witnessed the entire battle. They had assumed Antwerp was doomed. Many were even weeping softly while holding their children, or trembling and wondering where to hide them, or contemplating whether surrender would save their lives. However, before they could even form an answer, the monster approaching them from the sky transformed into a fireball and disintegrated in a series of explosions. The turn of events was too sudden. Many hadn't understood what was happening, only staring blankly as the monster that had terrified them collapsed before their eyes. Apart from occasional gasps of shock, no one spoke. After a long while, someone asked, "Was it our people who did it?" Immediately, someone replied, "Of course. Didn't you see what our planes fired?" "Yes, it was accompanied by smoke, and I saw it explode. Although I don't know what it was. When did we get such powerful weapons?" The crowd fell silent, looking at each other. None of them knew what kind of weapon it was. Suddenly, someone suggested a possibility. "Charles is in the city. He invented the tank and the sidecar. Could this weapon also be?" This sparked a lively discussion. "That's right, it must be. Who else could invent such a weapon besides him? God, he has saved us again." People clapped and cheered, many weeping with joy. They hugged their children tightly, repeatedly telling them, "We are saved. We are saved. Charles saved us. When you grow up, you must become like Charles. He is a hero, a role model for everyone." Someone started it, and people rhythmically chanted, waving their fists, "Charles, Charles, Charles." Albert I, overlooking the city from the watchtower, listened to the cheers below and nodded with satisfaction. Turning to General Guise, his eyes held the joy of a victor. "It seems the Belgian people also believe in Charles." "They believe in me, General." General Guise awkwardly stammered twice, unsure how to respond. He knew any rebuttal would be futile, merely a shameless slander, at least for now. In contrast to the high morale of the Belgian soldiers and civilians, the German soldiers were stunned and bewildered by this sudden disaster. The airship had flown from the east, passing over the German positions, and was shot down directly overhead. The soldiers saw every detail, even the shells fired from the plane. Flames rained down from the sky, some burned out in midair, disappearing completely before hitting the ground, while others crashed down with a thud, some even landing in the soldiers' trenches, where they scrambled for cover. The German soldiers didn't even consider trying to salvage it. They knew it was futile. The upper part of the airship was shattered, with only fragments of the lower part remaining. But all that could be seen was flames. Even the aluminum keel was ablaze, sparking and emitting blue smoke, burning like a volcano, the battlefield almost turning into inferno. After a long while, German soldiers discussed the scene with lingering fear. "Did I see that right? Was that a shell? It was a shell that destroyed it." "Yes, what else could it be but artillery? How did they manage to get the cannon onto the plane?" "This, you should ask Charles." And so everyone knew it was Charles's doing. The name Charles was etched deeply into their hearts like a red-hot iron, a vivid memory, haunting like a nightmare. Bessler silently watched all this, gradually slumping against a nearby rock, as if his own strength was no longer enough to support his body. Suddenly, he remembered Big Bertha. As long as Big Bertha remained, there was still hope for victory. Thinking this, Bessler jumped up and looked towards the Big Bertha, then shouted, "Protect the Big Bertha, planes, enemy planes." Bessler was quick-witted. He managed to remain rational and consider a possibility. If enemy planes were equipped with cannons to destroy airships, could they also destroy the Big Bertha? Therefore, when he saw two biplanes flying towards the Big Bertha, he immediately realized the battle wasn't over. The Big Bertha might even be Charles's real target. "Damn it, I've been tricked by Charles again." Bessler was furious. Destroying the airship was just to divert everyone's attention, including his. However, not everyone reacted so quickly. Everyone else stared blankly at the sky, some looking at Bessler, not understanding what he meant. Protect? How could they protect it? Why would planes bomb the Big Bertha? Wasn't it meant to bomb airships? Several German pilots reacted quickly. Just as the two biplanes dived in two directions toward the Big Bertha and pointed their noses at the target, a dove suddenly cut in and collided with one of the biplanes. The more fragile dove was instantly shattered, while the biplane, though sturdier, still had half its wing broken off. It lost its balance, tumbled towards the ground, and disintegrated with a cracking sound, soon bursting into flames. Bessler shouted excitedly, "One more! One more!" but he wasn't actually in command. The battlefield relied entirely on the initiative and self-discipline of the German pilots. In this era, no ground unit could command aircraft in flight, especially in such a critical, fleeting moment. Another German dove followed the last remaining biplane. It was piloted by Eric, who knew he was in danger, but he couldn't evade. It was a temptation. With Eric's flying skills, he could easily shake off the enemy, but he couldn't do that. Because if he evaded, he might lose his only chance to destroy the target. Thinking this, Eric could only grit his teeth and choose to ignore the dove's pursuit and maintain his flight path. This wouldn't succeed. The Avro biplane was indeed faster than the dove, but that was without rockets. Adding rockets not only increased its weight but also affected its aerodynamic design, allowing the dove to easily catch up and ram it. Eric wouldn't even have the chance to launch his rockets. He complained, "That's why the little guy wants me to trust the Belgians, he's thought of everything." But can I trust the Belgians? Before he could finish speaking, Eric felt a shadow sweep over his head, followed by a sharp crack behind him. A Belgian pilot sacrificed himself, crashing into the enemy, giving Eric the opportunity to launch. Eric didn't turn around, his eyes were fixed on the target, the distance closing in little by little. Then he slammed the detonator. Whoosh whoosh whoosh, whoosh whoosh. Rockets flew towards the target one after another. The image above shows the Dove monoplane, which was inexpensive and simple in structure. Its most distinctive feature was that the wings and fuselage were largely covered with linen, which was so transparent that sunlight could even penetrate it, making it difficult for infantry on the ground to spot. It was widely used for reconnaissance during World War I. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 96. Know When to Stop. Boom boom boom, rockets exploded one after another near Big Bertha. From the outside, it was impossible to tell whether they hit their targets. All that could be seen was that Big Bertha was engulfed in flames and smoke. Several artillerymen were killed or wounded, and some, their bodies ablaze, flailed and screamed in the flames. Charles couldn't even see what was happening through the aperture of his binoculars. Big Bertha was right in his blind spot. After a long while, there was still no follow-up. Charles sighed inwardly. It had ultimately failed. The rockets probably posed no threat to this tough-skinned creature, or perhaps they only caused it a minor malfunction, requiring only simple maintenance to make it usable again. Eric, who was on the mission, thought the same thing. He glanced back at Big Bertha, slammed his fist on the cockpit, and cursed, "Damn it, we need more rockets, let's do it again." But he knew it was too late. The Germans were prepared. Another attempt would mean facing not only German pilots but also Maxim guns set up high above, which would bombard him with dense bullets, preventing him from getting close or being torn to shreds. Boom! A loud explosion suddenly came from behind. Eric turned back again and saw that the location of Big Bertha had turned into a huge cloud of smoke. Eric immediately understood what had happened. He laughed loudly. It was a shell from Big Bertha. "I detonated its shell, little guy. We're so lucky, I really took it down, and it's still alive." Everyone knew what had happened. They were all too familiar with that sound, huge and muffled, with a thunderous aftershock. Antwerp trembled for over 10 days from the deafening roar. No one had imagined that the Big Bertha would ultimately fall to its own shells. Bessler was pale. Just moments before, he had been thankful there might still be a chance to save it, but in an instant, the Big Bertha was reduced to fragments. The smoke and dust hadn't yet cleared, but the Big Bertha's once proudly raised gun barrels now hung limply to the ground, lifeless. Another cheer erupted from Antwerp as people excitedly waved at the plane in the sky, their faces filled with joy and reverence. Eric deliberately lowered his fuselage as he flew over the crowd, eliciting screams and shouts, with some even chasing after him. Albert I glanced at General Guise and said, "General, it seems we don't need to carry out your raid plan, don't you think?" "Oh, of course, Your Majesty," General Guise replied, bowing his head. This should have relieved General Guise, since the target had been destroyed and Antwerp was safe, but he still felt immense pressure as he answered. General Guise believed that what King Albert I really wanted to say was, "Are you really suitable to be the commander of this fortress? Shouldn't we replace him?" King Albert I said nothing. He put away his binoculars, turned, and walked down the watchtower, trying to maintain his composure and elegance, the proper demeanor of a king. However, after descending one step, King Albert I couldn't help but stride forward, soon running. He couldn't wait to shake Charles's hand and tell him of the victory, that he had once again saved the Belgian people. Behind King Albert I, General Winter whispered to General Guise, "General, it seems we don't need to hand Charles over to the Germans anymore." General Guise hummed in response, slightly embarrassed, "Of course." Eric's plane slowly landed on the runway. As soon as he disembarked, he was lifted up by cheering crowds and tossed into the air again and again. Another biplane and a Dove landed, and Fuscher and another pilot disembarked, receiving the same hero's welcome. However, only this many men remained from the entire squadron. Of the 8 aircraft that went into battle, only 3 returned. The fallen were tragic and heroic, but people would still overlook them. Eric, seeing Charles approaching with his guards, raised his head and asked, "How did I do, sir?" "Not bad," Charles replied. "How about a jug of wine as a reward?" Everyone around laughed. The sound of hooves grew louder as the king's carriage sped towards them. It slowed after entering the airport gates and soon stopped in front of the crowd. The soldiers hurriedly lined up to greet him. King Albert I excitedly jumped out of the car, but upon seeing the soldiers' formation, he paused, his face hardening. He then stopped, shaking hands with the soldiers with an air of authority, praising them as he walked. "You are heroes of Belgium, well done. I am proud of you, on behalf of Belgium, I thank you." When they reached Charles, King Albert I's expression softened. He said, "May I speak with you, Lieutenant?" "Of course," Charles replied. The two did not return to their office but walked to the side of the airport. The airport was spacious, and as long as the guards kept them at bay, no one would know what the king and Charles were saying. "I know this is impossible, but," King Albert I hesitated, but finally spoke, "could you help me command the Belgian army? I believe Parliament will agree, as will the Belgian people, Your Majesty." Charles was taken aback. "I know, Charles," Albert I smiled. "You are French, which will be difficult for you. But I will do my best to give you everything you want." Albert I believed that even a 1 in 10,000 chance was worth trying. "You might think of it this way," Albert I continued, "France is winning, while Belgium is still in danger. France can do without you, but Belgium cannot, nor can the Belgian people. Belgium is safe with you." "No, Your Majesty, I cannot do that," Charles refused decisively. If Belgium were a country where Albert I could make the decision, Charles might have agreed. After all, the phrase "I will do my best to give you everything you want" was tempting. But the reality was different. The real decision-makers were the capitalist-controlled parliament. Therefore, Charles was not safe in Belgium. There was always a danger. If Charles were handed over to Germany, Germany would not attack Belgium. This wasn't a matter of morality or ethics, but rather a conflict of interests between nations, an unsolvable contradiction. Capitalists are the same everywhere. If Charles continued to stay in Belgium, this contradiction would eventually escalate. A wise person knows when to quit while they're ahead. Charles doesn't want to live in constant fear, it's pointless. Chapter 97 The Planned Guest. Sorry, only 2 updates tonight. An old classmate from university came all the way to visit. We haven't seen each other for years, and I refused his last visit, but I couldn't refuse this time. 3 updates tomorrow. The battlefield fell silent after the destruction of the Big Bertha. This silence was genuine. German morale had plummeted due to the bombing of the airship and the Big Bertha. Even disregarding morale, the Germans had no other equipment to bomb the fortress from outside enemy range. This made Antwerp like a hedgehog covered in sharp quills, weak yet impossible for the German army to exploit. More importantly, a rumor spread like wildfire within the German ranks. Charles had moved artillery onto airplanes. This might not be a rumor but a fact, since all the German soldiers saw it with their own eyes. The planes fired several shells, destroying the airship and the Big Bertha. Everyone heard the explosions and the flames. Coincidentally, the Congreve rockets were unused equipment that had been stored in warehouses for 50 years, and the German soldiers, now only in their 20s and 30s, had no idea what they were. Naturally, they let their imaginations run wild. If they can mount artillery on airplanes, they can attack us from the air too. Of course, we're much more vulnerable than airships and even the Big Bertha. Did you see what the Big Bertha looked like when it was destroyed? God, its 420mm cannon barrel was blown off. If a 420mm cannon barrel could be blown off, wouldn't blowing up their flesh and blood be as easy as walking or eating vegetables? Airplanes flew through the sky, coming and going like the wind, and the Germans had no way to deal with them, but airplanes carrying artillery could bomb them to their heart's content. Human beings share a common trait, fear of the unknown, and the more they think about it, the more afraid they become. The Germans were no exception, which made none of them dare to attack Antwerp, fearing they would become the first to stick their necks out and be hit by flying artillery. What frustrated Bessler even more was that desertions had broken out among the well-trained German troops. General Guise returned to headquarters alone. Sitting in his operations office, listening to the cheers of his men outside, his heart grew heavier. The images flashing through his mind weren't of the destroyed airships and the Grand Bertha, nor of the valiant Belgian planes, but of Albert I's gaze, a gaze filled with contempt, disdain, and even disgust. General Guise knew he had been completely abandoned by Albert I. Although Albert I held no real power, his good public reputation and image gave him considerable influence. It was through this that Albert I persuaded Parliament to make decision after decision. In reality, Albert I didn't persuade Parliament, but rather the Belgian people through public speeches, and Parliament, under public pressure, had no choice but to be persuaded. Given this, General Guise believed he likely wouldn't stay in his position for long. He considered resigning, a way to leave office with dignity. However, decades of effort and management ended in such a dismal failure, leaving him with a lingering sense of resentment. Just then, there was a soft knock at the door. Before General Guise could respond, de Brum entered, removed his hat, gave a slight bow to General Guise, and then closed the door behind him. Under General Guise's questioning gaze, he casually walked to the desk, pulled out a chair, and asked, "Can we talk?" Of course. General Guise nodded. De Brum was the leader of a powerful Belgian party, the Labour Party, and he certainly had the right to speak with General Guise. Note, the Labour Party is a pseudonym. Several old Belgian parties still exist today, and using their real names might lead to censorship. De Brum thanked General Guise and sat down opposite him, saying, "General, I don't know if you realize that Antwerp is on the verge of a crisis." On the verge of a crisis? General Guise looked puzzled, wondering if he had misheard. Hadn't the crisis just been resolved? But de Brum nodded firmly. "General, what do you think will happen next? Will the Germans give up?" General Guise considered for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "No, they won't. Antwerp is behind the German supply lines, and the king will keep sending men to raid it. The Germans must remove this thorn." De Brum hummed in agreement. "If the Germans only had 3 Grand Berthas, I believe we would have resolved the crisis, but that's not the case. The Germans have 10, or even more, which means, perhaps out of a soldier's instinct, General Guise gave a direct answer without hesitation, "If they dare to come, we dare to blow them up." "Is that so?" De Brum countered, staring at General Guise without speaking. Silence spoke volumes. General Guise immediately realized this was impossible. Charles used a Congreve rocket, which wasn't powerful enough to destroy the Big Bertha. The success this time was due to igniting the Big Bertha's propellant charge. They might not have had time to chamber the shell and the charge. Moreover, the next time a Big Bertha appeared outside the fortress, the Germans would be on high alert, making it difficult for aircraft to approach. After a moment's thought, General Guise asked, "What exactly are you trying to tell me?" De Brum replied softly, "Think about your friend's advice, General." "Friend?" General Guise frowned, immediately thinking of Bessler. Bessler's advice was the letter he had given him, which meant, "Hand over Charles." General Guise nearly jumped up in shock. Before, handing over Charles could be interpreted as a gesture towards Antwerp, but now, if that was still the case, it was tantamount to treason. But the next second, he immediately understood de Brum's meaning. Antwerp would fall sooner or later if things continued this way. Only by handing over Charles could this tragedy be prevented. "But," General Guise said, "the king won't agree, the Belgian people won't agree, they'll send us to the gallows as traitors." "Then don't let them know." De Brum handed General Guise a cigar. You see, Germany sent a spy into Antwerp to negotiate with him, but he couldn't resist the lure of a large sum of money and fled Antwerp overnight to join Germany. Without needing to be explicitly stated, General Guise knew who he referred to. After a moment's consideration, General Guise nodded thoughtfully. That seems like a very good suggestion. With the power General Guise wielded, it seemed easy to achieve this. All he needed was a little cooperation from the German side, not to expose the lie. And General Guise happened to have connections with General Bessler. De Brum reminded him, if you think it's feasible, then you should hurry, otherwise, General Guise immediately tensed up. Once Charles left Antwerp, Belgium would have no leverage in negotiating with the Germans, meaning Antwerp would only face destruction. What General Guise didn't realize was that if he were to recall their conversation word for word, he would discover that de Brum never mentioned Charles or any plans. It was all just General Guise's own conjecture. Thank you so much for the incredibly valuable donation. Thank you. Chapter 98: A different kind of protection. Charles didn't sense anything amiss. He only noticed that the guards outside the airport had increased 2 or 3 times. This seemed normal, though. After learning Charles was directing operations at the airport, people surged towards it like a tidal wave, crowding it layer upon layer. Even the runway was packed. At this rate, eating and sleeping would be impossible, and even getting planes to take off to engage the enemy would be difficult. Fortunately, soldiers soon arrived to maintain order, clearing the airport of its inhabitants and securing it tightly. That night, Charles stayed in the officers' quarters at the airport. This was because the war situation was far from over, and Charles needed to continue directing airport operations. The entire city was counting on Charles's aircraft artillery to hold off the Germans and secure final victory, so Charles couldn't easily leave his post. What puzzled Charles was that the guards were also protecting the planes. What were they worried about? Were they worried the pilots would damage the planes? Everything was fine before they arrived. Was this really necessary? But Charles didn't dwell on it, washed up, and went to bed. The moon was bright, the stars were few, and the autumn breeze was gentle. A carriage slowly made its way to the airport gate, stopping at the guards. The guards glanced at the presented identification, peered through the windows, and then let it pass. They were completely unaware that the deep ruts and heavy swaying of the carriage suggested there was more than one person inside. The carriage finally stopped in front of the officers' quarters. A man in military uniform alighted, straightened his cap, and walked straight towards Charles's quarters. The guards standing watch downstairs glanced in their direction a few times before continuing their aimless stroll. In the instant they turned away, several figures stealthily emerged from the shadows of the carriage. Half asleep, Charles heard a knock at the door. He turned on the light and groggily glanced at the clock on the wall. 11:30. Who would be visiting at this hour? Who is it? Charles asked. Since the kidnapping incident in Lavas, Charles had become more wary of everything, even when surrounded by guards. It's me, Winter. General Winter's voice came from the doorway. Charles opened the door, puzzled. Winter, in full military uniform, stood there. Charles noticed something strange about his expression in the lamplight. I'm very sorry to bother you at this hour, Lieutenant. General Winter removed his cap and entered. We'd like to know how you managed to move the cannons onto the plane. Can we talk about it? So that's what it was about. Charles yawned, thinking to himself, couldn't he come tomorrow? Just one more night? At daybreak, one glance was enough to recognize it as a congreve. Just then, General Winter handed Charles a note, giving him a wink while continuing, excuse our curiosity, Lieutenant. They're in a hurry, you know. This weapon could play a crucial role on the battlefield, and they think they can't wait a moment longer. Charles opened the note and read, you must leave immediately. General Guise and the counselors are plotting to hand you over to the Germans, because only then can this war be truly ended. Charles instantly understood what was going on. He had considered this conflict before, but he hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. But, Charles looked troubled. He remembered the sudden increase in guards at the airport. They must all be General Guise's confidants. How could he leave under these circumstances? General Winter handed Charles another note, his tone unchanged. I hope this won't be too difficult for you. If there are any issues with the industrial property rights, we can fund the purchase, if you'd like. Charles quickly took the note and unfolded it. It read, we've dealt with the guards watching the plane and woken Eric. You go down alone to the hangar? Charles nodded, and was about to reach for his uniform from the bedside table when Winter pulled him back. Winter gave him an angry look, as if to say, what time is it? Still thinking about changing clothes, Charles sighed, grabbed a pillow, and slipped out. He carried the pillow because of his last flight experience. In an open cabin, even in uniform, he was shivering from the cold during the day. If Charles were to fly back to Paris in his pajamas, he'd probably be frozen solid by the time he got off the plane. As soon as Charles stepped out, a British soldier came to meet him. Charles followed the soldier, stopping and starting intermittently, occasionally hiding behind a corner to wait for the patrol to pass by. Meanwhile, General Winter was still putting on his acting in his barracks. "I'm very sorry, we can't accept this price. It's far beyond our budget. I think you should at least lower it by 2 percentage points. Finally reaching the hangar, they found 2 Belgian guards tied up, their mouths gagged. Eric, though in the cockpit, was completely bewildered. Seeing Charles arrive, he lowered his voice and asked, "Hey, kid, what country are we?" Charles boarded the plane and replied, "You don't need to know what country we are, just know we're going back to Paris." Then Charles added, "Can you fly the plane safely back to Paris?" "I mean, tonight, of course," Eric replied, then complained, "But they won't let me bring alcohol, that's uncertain." Charles was speechless. In Eric's eyes, alcohol seemed more important than gasoline. The plane started up, and 2 British soldiers pushed open the hangar door and stood at attention, saluting the 2 men. Their piercing eyes seemed to say, "It's an honor to serve you." The surrounding Belgian guards, hearing the roar of the engine, rushed over, some shouting, others blowing whistles. But it was too late. The plane rumbled towards the runway, its speed increasing rapidly, soon leaving the pursuing guards behind. At the moment of takeoff, Charles glanced back. He seemed to hear General Winter shout, "These guards are traitors. They want to hand Charles over to the Germans. They are shameless traitors." Chaos erupted instantly at the airport. Major Fuchel and his crew charged towards the guards, shouting angrily. Several gunshots rang out. Eric piloted the plane, circling the airport for a short while. Looking down at the soldiers fighting amongst themselves, he shook his head and sighed. "Ugly politics, isn't it, kid?" He then added with a sigh, "I'll never understand any of this." "You don't need to understand," Charles said. "Just remember to sell me the aircraft manufacturing plant." Eric's heart warmed. What a kind little guy. He'd worried he'd forgotten about it, but it turned out he'd kept it in mind all along. Chapter 99 Flying Club. The image above shows a French gypsy cigarette, invented in 1910. Known for its strong, potent, and irritating flavor, it was one of 2 common cigarette brands in France at the time, the other being the French Gaulle, Paris, Carter's Flying Club. The cluttered office was filled with smoke. To the accompaniment of soft, soulful jazz music, Carter, with his full beard, held a half-smoked cigarette between his fingers. The thick, acrid smoke from the gypsy cigarette rose steadily as the black tobacco burned, a long ash already clinging to the tip, teetering precariously. But Carter's attention remained fixed on the pen and paper he was working on in his right hand. Finally, the ash broke off and fell. Almost simultaneously, Carter slammed the pen on the table, cursing, "Fuck it, I can never get the accounts right." This was Carter's 3rd attempt at the calculations, but 3 attempts yielded 4 different answers, none of which matched the amount. "I need an accountant," Carter complained, bringing the cigarette to his lips and taking several deep drags. The tobacco danced merrily in the flame, releasing its smoke with abandon. Carter exhaled a long puff of smoke, slumping into his chair like a bundle of straw, pondering whether he was truly suited to run the club. Looking back, he realized that starting the Flying Club was likely just a spur-of-the-moment decision. He dreamed of bringing home francs flying through the air, but reality was a room full of broken parts and trash, even the club sign creaking in the cold wind. "People these days, they don't understand what flying is," Carter said, his face weary. He was speaking from reality. Almost everyone in this era considered those who took to the skies to be reckless. "They'll always fall from the sky," was the most common assessment of pilots. Therefore, Carter had to convert the club into a dual-use facility, accepting missions from the military, allowing equally impoverished pilots to earn a meager income while the club itself remained afloat. Just as Carter was despondently contemplating his future, the roar of car engines and hurried footsteps came from outside. Soon, there was a knock on the door, and someone shouted, "Open the door! Open the door! We are the French army." Carter lazily got up, frowned, and muttered, "Rude fellow." Bang! The door was kicked open, and several figures rushed in, guns in hand. Carter panicked instantly. "Head, what do you want?" He thought he was being robbed, but upon closer inspection, He saw they were all in military uniforms, definitely soldiers. The fear in Carter's eyes instantly turned to anger. "Sir, this is my private property. If you want the plane, you should have told me beforehand." And Carter's gaze turned to the door and saw at least 1,000 soldiers gathered on the runway, all heavily armed and on high alert. He was immediately terrified. "And what?" A lieutenant strode in and stood in front of Carter. And Carter hesitated before answering, "Sorry, sir. I don't have that many planes. If you want to go anywhere, I can't take that many men." The lieutenant snorted, took the identification documents handed to him by the soldier, shone a flashlight on them, and asked without looking up, "The day before yesterday morning, there was a plane flying to Antwerp, remember?" Carter thought for a moment and nodded. "Yes, Eric took the mission." "What happened? Damn it, something must have happened to Eric." Carter thought. He had told him not to drink on missions. "Who ordered you to do this?" the lieutenant asked, looking up, glancing at the searching soldier and reminding him, "Cigarettes, there might be intelligence hidden inside." The soldier immediately and carefully put the cigarettes into a document bag. Carter was stunned for a moment, unable to react. "What do you mean? Instructions? Intelligence?" The lieutenant raised his wrist, shining the flashlight beam into Carter's face, as if pointing a gun at Carter's head. He repeated his words with emphasis. "Who instructed you to do this? Confessing will do you good, Mr. Carter. Isn't this a mission?" Carter thought there must be some misunderstanding. "I was just doing what you said." "You didn't know the person being delivered was Charles?" the lieutenant asked again. Carter replied, "I don't know, sir. They said it was a secret mission and wouldn't let me inquire." Suddenly, Carter realized something, his expression freezing on his face. "What? Charles? You mean Charles, the inventor of the tank? He was a passenger that day." The lieutenant grunted, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You finally remembered?" No, sir." Carter's eyes were filled with fear. "I didn't know he was Charles. If I had known, I would never have sent him to Antwerp. Only a fool would do that, unless I'm insane." But the lieutenant wouldn't listen to Carter's explanations. He raised his hand forcefully and ordered, "Take him away." Several soldiers escorted Carter away without a word, ignoring his protests. The lieutenant glanced at the long list in his hand under the beam of his flashlight, confirmed it was correct, and then jogged through the ranks to a convertible. He stood at attention, saluted, and reported, "All suspects are under control, General." Galleri grunted in response. He waited until now to make the arrests because he didn't want to create too much of a commotion and let the outside world know. After all, the Germans only suspected Charles was in Antwerp. If the Germans knew that Galleri had arrested the airport's head, their suspicion would immediately become confirmation, which would obviously be disadvantageous for Charles. Now that Charles was already on his way to Paris, he could arrest them all without any worries. Galleri shone a flashlight on the map in front of him and asked a series of questions in a deep voice. "Are the surrounding roads blocked? Are all the torches in place? Have the high grounds been checked?" Major General Monnery stepped forward and replied, "Everything is arranged, General." To welcome Charles, Galleri deployed an entire infantry brigade of more than 7,000 men at the Flying Club. He was even worried that someone might set up a machine gun on a high ground and shoot down Charles's plane. Galleri grunted and stepped out of the car. He tightened his trench coat and called out without turning around, "Laurent." Major Laurent immediately appeared beside him. "Yes, General," Galleri said expressionlessly. "Now you know what to do." "Yes, General." Laurent quickly straightened up and replied, "Stay with Charles, don't leave his side." Laurent couldn't forget the 2 days of confinement, and he couldn't forget the look in Galeri's eyes and the words he had spoken. "I trusted you, that's why I put you in charge of Charles's safety." Galeri's gaze was fierce, like he was looking at an enemy, wishing he could drag Laurent out and shoot him. "But you let them take Charles away right under my nose. Do you know what that means? Do you know what that means for France? Do you know what that means for the army?" Laurent was sweating profusely. He even believed that if anything happened to Charles and he didn't come back, he might spend the rest of his life in confinement, with no room for negotiation. Fortunately, none of that happened. Thank God, Charles was coming back soon. Laurent was so moved he almost cried. Chapter 100 was dismissed by God. 2 rows of torches stood neatly aligned on either side of the runway, like 2 rows of guards, indicating the aircraft's position and direction. A moment later, the rumble of an engine could be heard in the air, growing louder and closer. Galleri looked up at the dark sky, unconsciously taking 2 steps forward, but was stopped by a guard. "General, it's dangerous to get too close." Gallieni grunted and retreated as instructed. The pilot couldn't see anything in the darkness. All he could see were the 2 rows of torches. Anyone standing by the runway could easily be sliced in 2 by a passing wing, whether soldier or general. Finally, the plane appeared in the night, its altitude decreasing until it was visible to those below, though still a blurry black shadow. The plane seemed to misjudge its angle during its first landing, descending as if to land, but then abandoned the attempt, immediately pulling up and circling twice before finally landing smoothly on the runway. Gallieni and his soldiers immediately surrounded it. In the firelight, Gallieni saw someone stand up from the cabin in the distance. It was the little guy, and he breathed a sigh of relief. His heart, which had been hanging in suspense, finally settled. Then Gallieni awkwardly realized that he had considered all the safety issues, but hadn't thought to bring Charles a coat. The latter was wearing pajamas, hugging a pillow, shivering in the cold wind. Without hesitation, Gallieni quickened his pace, took off his military jacket, and rushed over to Charles, draping it over him and comforting him. "It's all right, little guy, we're home." "It's all right, General." Charles trembled uncontrollably, his teeth chattering. "I left my uniform and weapons in Antwerp, and the mission report." Gallieni laughed. He was still thinking about the mission report. "Bring a few more clothes." Gallieni turned and called out. Dozens of coats were immediately handed to Gallieni, and then Charles was carried into the car like a dumpling, still wearing Gallieni's general's hat. Charles was somewhat embarrassed. He must have looked very awkward, making a fool of himself in front of so many people. But strangely, the people around him seemed to look at him with only respect. As the car started, Charles turned around with difficulty and called out to Eric, "I'll come find you, Uncle Eric." "Okay," Eric waved and replied, "I'll be waiting for you here, little guy." At this moment, Charles didn't know that he didn't need to come here to find Eric. As the pilot who had taken Charles to Antwerp, Eric was naturally on Gallieni's list of suspects, even though he had brought Charles back. The car traveled back to headquarters, with cavalry clearing the way and guards standing on both sides. The entire road was blocked off. Sitting in the passenger seat, Gallieni remained silent for a long time before suddenly laughing. He turned slightly to Charles in the back seat and asked, "I heard you did some big things in Belgium and even received a Royal Crown medal." Charles then remembered the medal and replied regretfully, "I lost it in Antwerp." Gallieni chuckled, "Don't worry, Lieutenant, it won't be lost. The king will send it back to you." "What?" Charles didn't understand. Gallieni explained, "A lot happened in Antwerp during your 3+ hours on the plane. Antwerp now knows about General Guise's conspiracy." Charles hummed in agreement. This was within his expectations. General Winter wasn't alone, he had a force of 10,000 men. After Charles left safely, they would naturally reveal the truth as quickly as possible. "Want to know what happened to General Guise?" Gallieni asked. "He was dismissed," Charles guessed. Gallieni smiled slightly and replied, "Yes, he's been dismissed. This little fellow actually thought that imprisoning a benefactor who had saved the entire city, even betraying him by handing him over to the Germans, and ultimately forcing him out and placing Antwerp in injustice and danger, such treason was merely a dismissal? General Guise wasn't dismissed at all. Before Albert I could officially dismiss him, angry citizens stormed his headquarters, dragged him out, and nearly beat him to death. His savior was none other than Albert I, because the king wanted General Guise to be tried in front of everyone, especially to expose the mastermind and other accomplices. But Albert I was quickly disappointed. After General Guise was taken to the hospital, he was surgically cut more than a dozen times without morphine, each cut perfectly avoiding vital organs. The doctor said this was to find broken bones, but unfortunately, they couldn't find any. General Guise finally breathed his last in pain and despair. These things didn't seem necessary for the little guy to know. Let's just consider it a demotion, albeit won by God. Gallieni pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to the back, saying, "This is a telegram from Albert I. He apologizes and says he'll return your uniform, belongings, and medals." Charles took the telegram, but couldn't see it clearly in the darkness, so he just stuffed it into a pocket. He already knew the contents anyway. "But perhaps you don't need that uniform anymore." Gallieni thoughtfully glanced at the buildings on either side. Charles didn't ask any further questions, because the car had already stopped at the headquarters entrance. With the help of others, Charles returned to his quarters, wrapped himself in a blanket, drank 2 cups of hot milk before feeling warmer, and then drifted off to sleep. The next morning, Charles finally understood what Gallieri meant when he said the previous night that he didn't need that uniform. His orderly, Adrian, brought Charles 2 brand new sets of uniforms, complete with a revolver and other equipment. Charles was puzzled. Why 2 sets? He'd only lost one, and the other was in his barracks. After changing into the uniform, Charles realized that there was a gold thread on the cuff, which meant he was now a lieutenant. Gallieri watched with satisfaction as Charles walked into the operations headquarters in his new uniform. The people in the command post spontaneously applauded and cheered. "Well done, Charles, you've brought honor to France. They say sending you alone is far more effective than Britain sending 10,000 men." Gallieri had originally intended to act as fierce as usual. However, after a moment's thought, he stepped forward and nodded in praise. "You did very well in Antwerp, Lieutenant, you deserve it. Keep up the good work." Charles was taken aback, then immediately understood. Gallieri thought there was no need to put on a show for the capitalists anymore. After all, no matter what, the capitalists would be their enemies. That was unavoidable. "Yes, General," Charles straightened up and answered, his voice finally no longer trembling. "Today is your day off." Gallieri took out his pocket watch, glanced at it, and said, "Go home after breakfast. Your parents should be waiting for you at home." "Yes, General," Charles replied, looking a little confused. He thought he had just returned to headquarters to serve. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.